Welcome to the realm of legends. I'm so grateful to have you here today. Before we begin, if you enjoy the story, please consider supporting the author by checking the links in the description. If you'd like to request more web novels or unlock some exciting perks, feel free to explore the membership options. All the info is in the description below. Also, please like this video and subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on so you never miss future uploads. Every bit of your support helps keep me motivated and keeps these incredible stories alive. Now, without any further ado, let's dive in.
Chapter 1, Luke Poe, Boston, Massachusetts, United States. On one of the most marginalized streets of this great old city, a two-story building could be seen in very poor condition. Near the entrance of this old and dilapidated building, there was a simple old wooden sign that read "Orphanage, always happy." In one of the rooms of this building, you could see many bunks and beds side by side. In each bunk bed slept one child on the bottom and one on the top. There were also mattresses on the floor where there were more children. The children ranged in age from 4 years old to a maximum of 18 years old. As the sun had already risen and there were no curtains on the windows, the room was already fully illuminated. Suddenly the door of the room opened with a dreadful creaking sound that woke up several children. Others did not, as they were used to it and were still sleeping. "Wake up, you brats. If you don't wake up, you won't have breakfast, and you'll go to school on an empty stomach," shouted a middle-aged woman. The woman had black hair with some gray, some wrinkles, and dark circles under her eyes. She was wearing a white apron that protected her blouse and other clothing. "And hurry up or the others will steal your food," the woman exclaimed as she slammed the door shut. The shout and the slamming of the door woke all the children, who began to get up from their beds and quickly change. Many were talking to their friends, and a hubbub was created in the room. "How noisy," muttered a boy who was sleeping on top of one of the bunk beds. Not only was the sun shining on his face since there was no curtain to intercept the light, but now he had to put up with the bustle of all the kids. "Wake up, Luke, we can't miss breakfast," shouted a lanky boy who was sleeping on the underside of the bunk bed. "Don't bother, Tom," Luke said lazily. With a nimble movement, he pulled his pillow over his face, covering himself from the annoying sunlight and shielding himself a bit from the annoying bustle. Tom was used to how sleepy Luke was, so he didn't think anything of it, quickly changed and left the room. He didn't want to miss breakfast. In 10 minutes, all the boys were out of the room, except Luke, who was still sleeping, now more peacefully since the place was silent. Finally, 15 minutes later, Luke stirred. He pulled the pillow away from his face and sat staring around the room, which was a mess as more than 10 kids were sleeping, and they weren't tidy at all. Luke had light brown hair that looked almost blonde. He had blue eyes and prominent eyebrows that would give him an attractive appearance if he didn't have messy hair and a sleepy face. 13 years old, well, almost 14, thought Luke with a blank stare. Luke was a reincarnated person. In his previous life his name was also Luke, and he died at the young age of 13. "I wonder if I'll make it to 14, only a couple of weeks away," Luke thought. He wondered if he would die again at 13 and if it would be some sort of curse and endless cycle of reincarnation. It would be funny and painful. In his past life he was a big reader of novels of all sorts of genres, even fan fiction. He also watched series and anime and read manga, so when he was reincarnated he was very excited. He had thought he would be reincarnated into a world of epic battles and incredible powers. However, his expectations were not met. Well, part of it did, the powers part. Luke, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, looked down at his old worn-out shoes. He stared at them, and after a second the shoes began to levitate and float towards him. The shoes slid smoothly over his bare feet. The laces, untouched by anyone physically touching them, began to braid and tie deftly. Then an old jean jacket flew towards him. Luke discovered at the age of 6 that he possessed telekinesis. He could move objects towards him or throw them to another place at an incredible speed. At first, he could lift very light objects and had a hard time. But after a lot of practice, he could move heavier objects in more numbers at the same time. As a kind of muscle, if you practice with X weight for a while, you can move to the next weight, i.e. X1. Also, just looking at the objects was enough. He did not have to use his hands to move the objects. Another advantage was that he did not feel much fatigue compared to the beginning, so he could use his telekinesis without getting tired. If he moved objects of weights he was used to. The bad thing was that he could not find other people with powers just like him. At first he thought he might be in the Marvel universe, but it was 2019, and he never saw news of alien attacks, nor news of Iron Man, Spider-Man, or any other famous superhero. No black man with an eye patch came to the door of the orphanage telling him if he wanted to belong to a select group of superheroes. Nor did a bald old man in a wheelchair come to invite him to a school for children with strange and powerful powers. nor was he in the world of Harry Potter since no letter came to him at the age of 11. Although Hogwarts was not in the United States, there was supposed to be a magical school in the Harry Potter universe in the U.S. Although he couldn't quite remember its name, he didn't mind the idea of possessing superpowers in a world of normal people, but he knew the possibility of this was low. It would be strange if he was the only person with a superpower. It wasn't pleasant at all to go so many years without knowing what world he was in specifically. I'll leave that topic aside. Now I must go to school, Luke thought with a grimace as he landed on the ground softly and walked towards the door. He opened the door and began to make his way to the dining room, which was on the first floor. Living in an orphanage was not the best thing in the world. According to what Luke was told, his parents died a few days after he was born. He has very few memories of them, as when he was a baby, he was not yet fully aware that he had been reborn. He arrived in the dining room. In the center of the room was a long table with numerous chairs where all the children were seated. The table was dirty, as the children in the orphanages were not the cleanest. Luke found a place next to his friend Tom and sat squeezed in with the others. As there wasn't much space, the wooden chair he sat in made a strange creaking sound, and he could swear a splinter went up his butt. Luke was among the middle kids at 13, almost 14. The older ones were 17 and 18. When you turned 16, you were sent to work, since that's the basic minimum age for work if it wasn't a dangerous job. It was already impossible for him to get a family. Who in their right mind would adopt a 14-year-old? The same was true for his friend Tom and his children over the 10-year-old barrier. I protected your food, Tom said with his mouth full. You're very thoughtful, said Luke sarcastically, looking down at his plate of food without much appetite. A bowl of oatmeal and hard bread was his breakfast. Luke hated oatmeal. Life at the orphanage was not at all appealing. He shared a room with many noisy children. The facilities were falling apart and bordering on illegal. The food was scarce and tasted bad. On top of that, the clothes he had belonged to kids older than him, so they were all used. His shoes were in tatters. His white t-shirt looked yellowish because it was so old, and his jeans looked like they were of that fashion that had holes in them. This was Luke's least favorite thing about being reborn. Being in an orphanage. In his past life he had parents and was an only child. His parents were always on the road for work, so he had the whole house to himself and money to eat whatever he wanted or buy whatever novel or manga he pleased. It's better to have powers, thought Luke, who didn't want to think about depressing things. One of his goals was to get out of the orphanage as soon as possible and survive on his own. With his powers it was possible. He was still working on that plan. He didn't want to wait until he was 16 or 18. The only friend he had was Tom, and he was no big deal either. They would get into some mischief together, like picking on the orphanage caretaker or other kids his age who were looking for trouble. They got along a little well, but he wouldn't tell Tom his secrets either. No matter how simple they were, he didn't fully trust him. Both in this life and in his previous life he was a loner with no trusted friends. He wasn't proud of this, but it wasn't something that plagued him either. He liked solitude, and in the orphanage, he had no solitude at any time. Another curious thing was his full name in this new life, which was as follows: Luke Poe, the same surname as the famous writer and literary master of horror Edgar Allan Poe. Luke is a geek of all kinds of novels and short stories. Among others, knew the master of horror Edgar Allan Poe. His most famous tales are The Black Cat, The Golden Beetle, The Mask of the Red Death, and several others. When he learned his last name and that Edgar Allan Poe was his ancestor, he was excited. Not just anyone is a descendant of someone considered a literary master of horror, and his legend continues to persist through the years. Because of this, he thought he would have a large inheritance, but he did not. He didn't have a single dollar of inheritance. The only inheritance he had was from his parents. It was an old house on a forgotten street in Boston, even older than the orphanage. Again, reality hit him, as he could not claim the house and the items left to him by his parents. Claiming and managing an inheritance is a very complex legal process, and is subject to many laws. Since he is a minor, he cannot get his inheritance yet. He must wait until he comes of age. While he was thinking about all these things, he finished his bowl of oatmeal. Although he hated oatmeal, if your only food is oatmeal, you get used to digest it or you will starve to death. The bus is coming. Get out, shouted the middle-aged woman. The children began to file out without much order. Luke quickly ate the stale bread while helping to digest it with water. Then he grabbed his backpack and started to follow the others. Luke, come here, said the middle-aged woman. Luke turned slowly with a frown. The middle-aged woman was the caretaker of all the children. Her name was Bethany Miller. She was strict, but she wasn't mean like they show them in the movies and series. Yes, asked Luke dryly. You be good, the year is almost over. I don't want you to cause any more trouble at school and get expelled. It won't be any good for a kid in an orphanage to have on his record that he was expelled from 3 schools, said Bethany, looking sternly at Luke. Luke had been expelled from 2 schools before. The reason? He played a practical joke on the bullies who were picking on him. Even though the school had no evidence against him, he was charged and expelled from school, since the bully said it was him and since one of his parents was rich. He was kicked out with a kick in the butt. In the second one it was similar, just a different joke. At this new school he already had some minor problems, but so far nothing serious. Again there was a group of bullies who picked on him for being from an orphanage. Having old clothes and supplies and being attractive, the latter, he thought. Luke with psychic powers would not be easily intimidated and always ended up clashing with the bullies. He wouldn't use the powers to sweep the floor with them though, as it would be bad for the government to do experiments on him. He still wasn't strong enough to take on multiple people with guns. This time Luke had a very big practical joke prepared. He was waiting for the right moment to execute it. As you say, Mrs. Miller, I won't do anything, replied Luke, lying through his teeth. He already had all the preparations ready. This time it would be impossible for them to accuse him of the prank. He had planned everything. You better keep calm. Go, said Bethany with a frown, not believing Luke's words much. Luke turned and left in a hurry. He didn't want to miss the bus and had to walk to school. Chapter 2. Shit. Luke boarded the bus and noticed that it was almost full. Luckily, Tom had saved him a spot in one of the seats at the back. On the bus, Luke didn't cross paths with any of the people who picked on him, since unlike him, they had parents to drive them to school. Are you sure about doing the prank? Asked Tom as Luke sat beside him. Yeah, it's best not to talk about it here, said Luke, who didn't want anything to leak out. For some of the prank preparations, Luke needed help from Tom, so he was the only person aware of the big prank that would happen this Saturday. Luke knew that Tom hated bullies just like he did, so that he wouldn't do anything stupid. Friday was the end of school, and on Saturday there would be a party where the whole school would go. It is the perfect time for Luke's revenge and to teach the stupid bullies and the inept school staff who turn a deaf ear despite Luke's, Tom's and other orphanage kids' complaints. They finally arrived at the school. Luke got off the bus and walked towards the front door accompanied by Tom. As they walked through the school halls to their lockers, Luke could hear a voice addressing him. Nice shoes. Luke, don't you have money to buy a new pair? Luke turned his head and noticed a group of 4 boys. The one in the middle was the one who spoke and the leader of them all, Brad Thompson. He's the leader of the school's soccer team and one of the most popular people. The stereotype of Brad was so cliché that it made Luke want to vomit. He couldn't believe that there is such a normie person who meets all the requirements for a typical school bully. I doubt they have any money in that smelly orphanage, commented a friend of Brad's. And everyone started laughing out loud. I see you're taking more pains with your teasing. Well done. What's it going to be tomorrow? My parents? No, wait. That's what they already made fun of, Luke said thoughtfully. Maybe they can make fun of the holes in your pants, said Tom with a slight smile. Oh yeah, that they haven't made fun of yet, nodded Luke, looking down at his pants, and his right tibia was a hole leaving his leg in full view. Did you hear that? That's a good suggestion. Write it down lest your stupid brains forget it, added Luke with a slight smirk. Tom next to him started laughing out loud. Don't get smart, Luke, snarled Brad, clenching his fists and moving aggressively towards Luke. Luke didn't back down. Even though he weighed 20 less than Brad, he wasn't afraid. His eyes glared at Brad with contempt. With his psychic powers, he could finish the fight in seconds. Maybe he should break his leg and have his soccer career end prematurely. The only thing that protected Brad and his stupid friends were the rules of society, and Luke didn't want to show everyone that he had powers. Stop it, everyone. The bell is rung. Go to your classrooms, said a straight brown-haired woman, putting herself between Brad and Luke. You saved yourself this time, lunatic, snarled Brad, bumping into Luke's shoulder and going to his classroom with his friends. Don't start silly fights, Luke. No good will come of it for you, said the brown-haired woman who was one of the teachers at the school. I didn't start the fight, said Luke, annoyed. It was always the same. The adults would side with the bully just because their family had some power. In Brad's case, his older brother was a professional football player and so was his father. Now his father was retired and brought large funds to the school. Go to your classrooms, said the teacher, pretending she didn't hear Luke's comment. The classes went by. Boring as usual. Luke in his past life had already done the 8th grade, so it was no challenge for him to pass it this time. It was even easier than before since his telekinetic powers were not just for moving objects with his mind. He had a photographic memory. Just by reading a book once he remembered everything. Comprehension depended on him, but since it was a grade he had taken before, it was not difficult at all. This could also be one of the reasons why he became a target for bullies, since he had excellent grades compared to them. In addition to his attractiveness, he was the envy of everyone, or so he and his narcissism thought. However, this was not enough to get the school staff on his side. After the school day was over, Luke and Tom wasted time on the mean streets of Boston. It was better than being in the orphanage with a lot of noisy, disruptive kids. The week passed normally. Luke held back and didn't start any fights with Brad and his group of friends. He couldn't get himself expelled before the big prank. On Friday, Mrs. Miller congratulated him on finishing school without being expelled. On Saturday, a little before 7 p.m., the students started making their way to school, dressed smartly. The dance started at 7. As for Luke, it was obvious that he would not participate in a stupid dance. He hated dancing, making embarrassing movements with your body while listening to music that wasn't to your liking. Tom would take it upon himself to go and be the person to open the doors for Luke so he could execute the prank. Tom had invited a girl named Nancy from his grade. By about 8 o'clock, Mrs. Miller had sent all the kids to bed even though it was Saturday. Luke, after a few minutes, slipped out of the orphanage and started heading for an old storage room that they used with Tom to store junk and things they found useful. Here he had stored what they would use for today's prank. The warehouse was in a very run-down and sparsely frequented area. The sheet metal door was barely standing. Opening the sheet metal door, a putrid smell invaded Luke's nostrils. He quickly held his nose, and an evil grin formed on his face. In the small, dilapidated warehouse were 4 buckets of about 20 liters each filled with shit. That's where the smell was coming from, even though there was a lid on each bucket. It took Luke many weeks to accumulate that much shit. The joke was to fill the ballroom with shit through the sprinklers in the ballroom. They had already figured out with Tom how to accomplish this. There was also a blue plastic recycling garbage can in the storage room. They should use it when Luke gets to school. In that garbage, they can dump the 80 liters of shit. How would he carry 80 liters of shit to school? With a bicycle and his telekinetic powers. The bike was in this very warehouse. It was black and somewhat worn. Luke had already plotted a route days before and already knew it by heart. It was a route to school without many lights and little elapsed time. If he saw a person quickly, he would have to lower the buckets floating to the ground. As for the blue garbage can, he would carry it on his back, as it was not heavy at all. Without wasting any time, he took the bicycle, and with his mental powers he floated the 4 buckets full of shit. The trip caused him little fatigue, even though he was moving about 80 kilograms of weight for several minutes without stopping. Luckily for Luke, he did not encounter any people on the dark road and made it to the school without any problems and with his buckets of shit safely. The only unpleasant thing was having to smell shit for over 15 minutes. He made his way to the back of the school, where the hall they were using for today's dance was located. At one of the back doors of the hall, he waited patiently for Tom after texting him that he had arrived. After 5 minutes, the door opened. It was Tom wearing a suit a size larger than his size. Luke could tell that Tom had red lipstick on his lips. "Looks like you managed to kiss Nancy Parkinson." "Congratulations," Luke said sarcastically. He didn't find Nancy Parkinson attractive at all. "That was amazing. Her lips tasted like strawberry," said Tom, not noticing Luke's sarcasm as he was happy that he had managed to get his first kiss. "Information I'd rather not know. Come on, load 2 buckets." "I'll load the other 2, Luke said with a grimace as he grabbed 2 buckets and went inside. "Shit, sure are heavy," thought Luke, doing a great amount of force and having sweat on his forehead. The same was true for Tom. The telekinetic pods were broken. "How did you carry 4 buckets in here?" asked Tom, supporting the buckets and wiping sweat from his forehead. "Don't ask," Luke said as he reached for the blue recycling garbage can. He placed the garbage can near a hydrant that was connected to the sprinkler system. Between Luke and Tom, they started pouring all the crap into the big blue garbage can. "Do you have the hose?" asked Luke. "Yes, here," replied Tom, pulling a double-connected hose out of a corner. Luke took it and placed one hose connection on the bucket full of shit and the other on the hydrant, which was the connection point that allows water to be supplied for irrigation or firefighting systems. In this case, to supply a lot of shit. Shit is generally not liquid like water, so Luke had to use his powers to crush it and make it as liquid as possible. He never thought he would use his powers for such a task, but he didn't want to have to crush it with his feet or hands. "All set, go to the dance. When I text you, set off the fire alarm. Don't let anyone see you," Luke said, and Tom nodded as he walked back to the dance floor. There was a very hidden fire alarm, and it would be hard to be seen. "Just be careful." Luke, meanwhile, took the 4 empty buckets and started cleaning up the crime scene. The only thing they would leave behind would be the big blue bucket. He hid his bike away from the place and stealthily climbed onto the roof of the place, where there were windows that would make it possible for him to observe the whole place without any problem. He watched in disgust as all the students danced happily. There was Brad, his girlfriend who was the head cheerleader of the school, and all the most popular students with their dates. There were also the teachers and the old principal. Without a second thought, he sent a simple message to Tom: do it. So, within minutes, chaos broke out on the dance floor. The fire alarm started the chaos. A large amount of liquid shit started coming out of the sprinklers. At first, the students and teachers danced happily, before they noticed something falling on their heads and soiling their clothes. Luke began to hear everyone screaming in horror at the shit all over them. They were being bathed in shit. He could see Brad's girlfriend poking all over him. Disgusting, Luke thought with an evil grin as he watched his masterpiece. The whole hall was ruined. The food, the punch, the expensive costumes of many students, everything serves them right. May they get an infection or something. It's best to leave, thought Luke, leaving the crime scene. All the victims would start coming out, and it wouldn't do any good for anyone to see it. Luke left the bike and the 4 garbage cans in the old warehouse and returned to the orphanage unnoticed by anyone. Everyone was sleeping peacefully. Chapter 3. Anger. The next day, Luke woke up in a good mood. Brad and his stupid friends had gotten what they deserved. So had the teachers, who turned a deaf ear to the complaints of Brad and the company's victims. The only bad thing was the innocent people who participated in the dance were bathed in shit. Nothing can be perfect, right? One bath and they'd be as good as new. As he climbed down from his bed, he noticed Tom wasn't there. He must be having breakfast, Luke thought as he left the room and headed for the dining room. Halfway there, he was intercepted by one of the older girls at the orphanage. Her name was Rachel, and she always had a very unfriendly look. "Mrs. Miller is looking for you," Rachel said without much explanation. Why?" asked Luke. "I don't know, but it sounds serious." "What have you done this time?" asked Rachel with judging eyes. "I haven't done anything," huffed Luke indignantly as he headed for Mrs. Miller's office. When he reached the door, he entered without knocking. It was the 21st century, and he was 13 years old. He should not have to comply with such formalities. Mrs. Miller's office was as shabby as all the rooms in the orphanage. In the center was an old wooden desk. In the chair facing the front was Mrs. Miller, and in the visitors' chairs were 2 people who did not look good to Luke. They were Principal Winks and Vice Principal Isabella. It was not a good thing for these 2 people to be at the orphanage on a Sunday. "You were looking for me?" asked Luke, acting normally. "Yes, sit down," said Bethany. "Why is the principal of the Big Brighton High School here?" asked Luke in an exaggerated tone. "Don't play dumb, Luke. We know you're responsible," said Isabella in a stern tone, scowling at Luke. "The responsible one for what?" asked Luke. His expression was one of bewilderment. "For showering all the students and staff of the school with excrement at the dance last night," Isabella replied awkwardly. Luke thought it was funny that she used the word excrement instead of shit. "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't go to the dance, and from early on we all went to sleep at the orphanage," Luke replied. "Luke, stop lying. We have proof. Tom already confessed and showed several proofs to the director that you were the mastermind," said Bethany, sighing and showing him Tom's cell phone. Luke's expression turned puzzled as he looked at the cell phone in Mrs. Miller's hand. He knew immediately that it belonged to Tom. "That backstabbing son of a bitch," thought Luke with a cold look that hid fury. "Where's Tom?" asked Luke, trying to contain his anger. If he saw him now, Tom's arm might twist in mysterious ways. Now is not the time to talk about that. "Tom already confessed, and the evidence he showed us presents you as the mastermind," said Principal Winks, speaking for the first time. "That doesn't take the blame away from him. Your friend was complicit and will get his punishment accordingly. However, your punishment is far more serious," commented Isabella. "That fucking bitch putting all the blame on me. How did they catch him?" Luke thought with a frown. The plan was perfect. Clearly it was Tom's fault. Someone must have seen him when he pulled the fire alarm or something. To save his skin and minimize his punishment, he put all the blame on Luke. A real rat. How useless. He can't complete a simple task properly, Luke thought disaffectedly. "What punishment are we talking about?" "Just expel me and that's it," snorted Luke in an annoyed tone. He no longer cared about being expelled. With his powers, he could survive without any problems in the world. That was the decision at first. "But with the parent board and Mrs. Miller we have come to an agreement," said Winks. Luke looked at him and raised an eyebrow, waiting for his sentence. "When you start 9th grade you will be suspended for 2 weeks of school. Before that, during the vacations, you will do community service for a month, cleaning up parks, helping at shelters and that sort of thing. But first you'll have to clean up the mess you made. These days you must clean up the ballroom, which is full of excrement," Winks explained in a calm tone. Luke couldn't believe his ears. Rather than this, he would rather be expelled. However, it was not good to show anger. The best thing to do was to accept and sneak out of the orphanage. "Fine, I'll do it," nodded Luke, looking understanding. "Oh, I almost forgot. Mr. Thompson also asked that you send a video offering your apology." All the parents agreed. "You know how technology is. Ask someone to record you and apologize sincerely," added Winks. Luke's eyes widened in surprise and anger. It was obvious that this would be Brad's stupid father. This time, he couldn't contain his anger. As far as grades went, he was one of the best students in the school. If it wasn't for Brad and his gang, he would have no problem at all and he could pass his school years peacefully. But always the teachers and other adults sided with Brad and his stupid family with money. "Fuck you, old man," shouted Luke as he waved his hand, exposing his middle finger. 2 weeks of being suspended and missing classes, having to copy a lot of homework. A month cleaning parks and helping homeless people, cleaning a classroom full of shit and then having to humiliate himself and send a video apology. This old man was having too much imagination if he thought he would do all that. Maybe age was getting to him. And he was a little senile. "Disrespectful," exclaimed Isabella, getting up from her seat and looking at Luke, unable to believe what he had done. "You too, fuck you, you old bitch," exclaimed Luke, pointing his middle finger at Isabella. "Luke," exclaimed Mrs. Miller. Luke said nothing to her. Despite everything, he felt a modicum of respect for Bethany and held her in a little higher esteem compared to other people, just a little. With nothing more to say, Luke quickly left the office, brutally closing the door. He hurried down one of the hallways of the orphanage. Under a tile, he pulled out several bills that he had gotten in a not-so-legal way. It was time to leave the orphanage. He would not miss it, of that he was sure. The only person he talked to had betrayed him, and Mrs. Miller hadn't done much for him all these years either. He put the wad of bills in his old wallet and started walking towards the exit. He had no other belongings. He would only leave some old clothes behind, and his old cell phone he always had with him. The last thing he heard as he left was Mrs. Miller's shout telling him to go back. But he didn't look back. He ran to the old warehouse, grabbed his bike, and started pedaling without a fixed destination. After pedaling for 30 minutes, he stopped at a traffic light on one of the main streets near the school. "Where will I go?" thought Luke, with a mixture of emotions: anxiety, excitement, joy, anger. He had to get as far away from Boston as possible. He didn't want the police to find him and send him back to the orphanage. While Luke was thinking about these things, on the front street diagonally across the street from him was a huge black SUV. Each wheel was almost the size of Luke's bike. Luke's gaze shifted to the large, imposing pickup truck. His brow furrowed as he noticed the people in the van. An inner rage grew like an uncontrolled fire inside Luke. It was the Thompson family. The man driving was Brad's father, a gray-haired man with green eyes and a look of confidence. Next to him was Brad's older brother, who looked like a carbon copy of his father, but younger. In the back of the van was Brad with one of his friends who was always bothering Luke. The traffic light changed to green, and the van moved forward. Luke followed it with his eyes, and suddenly an invisible force hit the van violently, causing it to rise several meters and make a surreal turn in the air. Within seconds, the van landed abruptly on the pavement. Its wheels faced the sky. The car behind the van came to a quick stop, and the driver's eyes were wide open, not understanding what had happened. Luke's anger gradually dissipated. Again he unleashed chaos, this time on the street. More and more people were arriving and making their way to the van, trying to see if the people inside were okay. "Shit," thought Luke as he quickly pedaled away from the scene on his bike. Chapter 4: Family Ghost. Luke was pedaling like never before, dodging cars, pedestrians, and potholes nimbly. He never thought his emotions would get so out of control and use his powers unconsciously. That was a damn self, thought Luke with sweat on his forehead. After 20 minutes of pedaling, he pulled into a dark alley and sat on the ground, breathing heavily. How much did an SUV weigh? As far as Luke knew, it had to weigh about 2 tons or so. 2 bloody tons, thought Luke with a smile. So far Luke's weight limit was about 100 Inc. He was a long way short of achieving lifting 2 zero or more. Even Luke didn't know if such a feat would be possible. But now he knew. In the future he would be able to lift 2-ton vans like nothing else and send them flying. He would be invincible. Well, not quite. There are still heavier things and very dangerous military weaponry, and he also doesn't know if there are beings with powers more powerful than his. I wonder if they'll be okay. Luke thought of Brad's family. Although Luke detested Brad and his family, he didn't want to kill them either. He wasn't a serial killer, nor did he want to be a wanted criminal, even though they couldn't link him to the accident. It was just a little accident. They should have some injury or other. I hope his leg is broken, Luke thought as he got back on his bike and resumed his journey. He already had a destination in mind: his parents' old house, his inheritance. Although he didn't have the keys, with his powers it would be a piece of cake to get in. Maybe there would be something useful there that he could use on his journey before he left Boston. Boston was very big and the house was a long way from the orphanage. If he had a car he'd get there in a few minutes, but by bike it took an hour. Why the fuck is it so far away? Luke cursed as he got to the block where the house was. He had been here once before. Several years ago he walked down the block on foot with his bicycle. It was deserted. There was not a single person walking, not a single car on the street. Luckily it was daylight, otherwise it would be a very scary street. Luke stood with his defenses up, ready to act in case some homeless guy asked him for money for drugs or wanted to rob him. The houses on the blocks were trashed and abandoned, in a deplorable state. Luke was sure that vagrants and drug addicts were using them to spend the night and get high. To his luck, his house had the bars in place, albeit badly rusted. It looked like no junkies wanted to get in. Luke thought it would be because of the scary look of the house. It looked like a haunted mansion. Luke approached the big iron gate. It was locked with a padlock. To open it he needed a key, which Mrs. Miller most likely had. The bars were too high to climb and had very rusty spikes. He didn't want to catch tetanus or something like that. He could break the lock with his telekinetic powers, but he didn't want to leave the main entrance to his house unprotected and let vagrants in. So he started looking for a way in from the surrounding area. He got as far as the back, and behind a large bush he found a small gap under one of the walls. I could make it a little bigger, Luke thought, setting the bike aside. In a few minutes the hole was a bigger size where he could fit. How did he do it? With his powers. He couldn't just move objects with his mind. Telekinetic powers are not limited to just lifting objects with the mind and being able to throw them at high speeds. A better explanation is that the standard telekinetic ability allows you to move matter with your mind. With this you can move objects and manipulate telekinetic waves. One of the basic abilities Luke developed allows him to hit a thing or target with a slashing motion of his hand with his telekinesis. He called it psychic punch, although he does not name his attacks out loud when he performs them. With this ability, it is a piece of cake to dig a well and would even allow Luke to break the lock or break a person's neck, but the latter is not something he thinks about regularly. He thought about it a couple of times with the bullies bothering him. He stepped through the gap without a problem and started walking through the mansion's yard, which was huge and scary. The grass was yellowish instead of green and came up to Luke's waist. It's gigantic. If it was well kept and in a better location it would be worth a lot of money, Luke thought as he reached the back door. The door as expected was locked, and Luke didn't want to break the lock. After all, this house would be his in a couple of years. He walked over to a window and looking inside, he unlocked it with his powers. Easy, thought Luke with a slight smile. As he entered the house, he was surprised to see that the house was in better condition than he expected. The walls and floor were made of sturdy material. The only thing was that there were cobwebs everywhere and a lot of dust. This is where my parents lived, thought Luke in a strange mood. He had entered from the kitchen side. There were dirty dishes and glasses in the sink. The refrigerator was full of dirt, and when he opened it, a horrible smell filled his nostrils. There was a lot of food left, and it was expired. There was nothing useful in the kitchen, so he moved on to the next room, the dining room. It had a large old wooden table and chairs with cushions full of dust and cobwebs. In the center of the table was a vase. The flowers had fallen on the table and were completely black. He found nothing either, so he went to the next room, which was the living room. It was larger than the dining room. It had a higher ceiling, gloomy decorative moldings, and a central fireplace. What is that decoration? Thought Luke, looking at the wall where there were many skulls and black roses. They were descendants of the literary master of terror, so he didn't give it any more importance and kept looking. Finally, he came to an interesting place, the library. The place was large and there seemed to be a lot of bookshelves. Most likely there were hundreds of books in the place, full of dust clearly. In one part of the library there was a fireplace and black sofas for comfortable reading. Although he did not have a single penny of inheritance, the house alone was a very good inheritance. Not every person had a house of this size. As for the location, Luke didn't mind. With his telekinetic powers, he wouldn't be afraid of a couple of drug-addicted bums. Out of curiosity, Luke started flipping through a couple of books. They were all of the horror genre. He was able to find books by his ancestor Edgar Allan Poe. As his fingers ran along worn book spines, something in a dark corner of the shelf caught his eye. The subtle glint of a black necklace captured his gaze. As he drew closer, the gleam of the ornament shimmered with a peculiar radiance. This might come in handy, thought Luke, who was planning to sell the ornament. Perhaps he could make a few dollars profit. He reached out his hand and took the necklace carefully. The moment the cold metal touched his skin, a wild black mist detached from the necklace itself. The mist condensed and materialized into the figure of what appeared to be a ghost. Luke stepped back quickly, his gaze alert and puzzled. He didn't let go of the necklace, as every dollar would come in handy on his journey. If he were a normal person, he would be scared shitless. But with his powers, he wasn't afraid of anything, although he didn't quite know if his powers could affect a ghost. The ghost had a dark costume and was from the 1800s era. He had deep-set dark eyes, not very long hair, and a strange mustache. His face was serious and he was examining Luke. Edgar Allan Poe, muttered Luke with his mouth ajar. He had seen many pictures of his great-great-grandfather. He couldn't be wrong. Being technical with the term would be his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, but it's easier to just call him a great, correct? I'm Edgar Allan Poe, your ancestor. It's been a long time since I surfaced. It's awful to be locked in a collar for 13 years, said Edgar as he flew across the room and looked around the library. Maybe I should write some account of that experience, muttered Edgar, flying from one shelf to the other. Luke's eyes followed the ghost, still processing what was happening. It was the third strangest situation of his life. Of both his lives, the first was when he found out he was reincarnated. The second was when he realized he had telekinetic powers. And now this new situation. So what exactly did you come out for? Asked Luke after a few seconds as Edgar was still exploring the library. To train you and claim my revenge, Edgar replied with an evil grin and eyes flashing hatred. Cliché, thought Luke for the revenge part. Train me? Did you have powers just like me? Asked Luke, interested more in this topic. In his past life, as far as he knew, there were no supernatural powers. And Poe must have been a normal person, or so he thought. Maybe he was in the same world as in his past life, but now he was born with powers, and there were always powers in his previous world. Most of them are struck by the revenge part, Edgar said, looking strangely at Luke. Well, it makes sense that he would be more interested in powers. He grew up in a normie environment. There's a lot he doesn't know, thought Edgar, shaking his head. Looks like you've already trained more family members, commented Luke, looking suspiciously at Edgar. If you wanted to train him to claim revenge, it means that the previous family members didn't get it and might have died for this revenge. Oh, looks like we've got a smart guy here, nodded Edgar with a slight smile. What you think is true. You're not the first member of the Poe family I've trained, Luke added. Edgar, how do you know my name? Asked Luke with surprise. I trained your father, and before he was killed he told me that you would be the one to end the Poe family grudge, replied Edgar. So, my father died for trying to get this revenge, right? Asked Luke in a judging tone. Since his father and trying to get Edgar's revenge. Yes, your grandfather also died trying to fulfill my revenge, and there's a chance you will also suffer the same fate, Edgar replied matter-of-factly. And why would I agree to fulfill your revenge? Asked Luke. As juicy as the idea of going on a quest for revenge was, he had other priorities at the moment. Who doesn't want to seek revenge for their family, smash the culprits and crush their corpses? Besides, he was confident in his powers, although he now knew he was not the only one with powers. As Edgar, his grandfather and father seemed to have powers, this meant that his enemies would have powers, but he was not afraid. It will be fun to crush people with powers just like him. And the fight could be exciting. You don't have much choice. My old enemies won't rest until the Poe family is exterminated. They will come looking for you with their new successors. Your parents managed to hide you, but they will soon find you. The Poe surname is not common, and that you are an orphan proves that you are their son. I started with the grudge, but it's already part of the Poe family. You can't escape, Poe explained calmly. The best thing is for you to be trained by me. That way your psychic powers will improve and you will be able to defend yourself. Then you will kill them, added Poe with a ghoulish grin. Luke had a thoughtful look on his face. What his wacky ancestor was saying made sense. If they were coming to kill him anyway, it was better to have someone to give him information about his enemies and train him in his psychic abilities. What do you say to me? A life of revenge is best, Poe said as he gently stroked his mustache. Good, your training better come in handy or I'll sell the necklace to the first bum I see, replied Luke. That's great. I hope this time the Poe family's revenge comes true. Maybe you should make sure you leave an heir, in case things go wrong. Find a nice girl and sleep with her, Poe said as he explained to Luke how babies were made. Luke had a blank look on his face. He couldn't believe Edgar was explaining to him how to make babies so explicitly. No need to explain further. Unlike my father, grandfather, or you, I won't fail, Luke said, interrupting Edgar. Oh, it's good to be confident, but not too confident or you'll run headlong into a wall at some point, Edgar said with a slight smile, before Luke could respond. Edgar looked to the right. I sensed the presence of several people at the entrance. He muttered in bewilderment. Luke could hear mumbling and made an ugly expression. He had an idea of who the people would be. He put the necklace in his pocket and ran straight into the garden. Edgar seemed to be attached to the black necklace, so he followed Luke automatically. "What's wrong? Do you know them?" "I don't think our enemies have found us," said Edgar curiously. "It's a long story," said Luke as he grabbed his bike and started his escape again. Chapter 5. What's? Luke, with his bike and a ghost following him everywhere, went to a gas station convenience store to buy some food. He was very hungry. He hadn't been able to eat breakfast. On the way, he told Edgar just enough about how he ended up getting kicked out of school and running away from the orphanage. He told him about his parents, who died when he was very young. Although he already knew this, according to Edgar, strong men are raised without parents. A peculiar thought. "Do you have any money?" asked Edgar as Luke entered the store. He could see the look of his great-grandson, and he didn't look like someone with a lot of money. "Yes," Luke replied dryly. He didn't want other people to see him talking to the air and take him for a crazy person. According to what Edgar told him, only Luke can see him since he has Poe's blood. And he has the necklace. Luke looked for a seat in the back and was as lonely as possible. He ordered a can of cold Coke and a pizza all to himself. Today was a special occasion. He would treat himself. When he had the pizza on the table, he began to devour it at great speeds. As if it were the last dinner, Edgar watched him with a look of envy. It had been a long time since he had been able to savor a delicious meal. "So tell me, who are your mortal enemies?" asked Luke. "In due time you will know. The first thing is to find a safe place where you can train and continue your studies," replied Edgar. "Continue my studies?" asked Luke in disgust. He had no plans to go back to school. With psychic powers as strong as his, if he continued his studies, he would be an idiot. "I won't go back. The school has nothing useful to teach me," added Luke. "I'm not talking about those normie schools," said Edgar in disgust at the mention of normal schools. "Normies," thought Luke with a raised eyebrow. Looking at his great-great-grandfather, it was a very current term for a person from the 1800s to use. In internet slang, normie was used to refer to very normal, stereotypical things. For example, Brad and his girlfriend. "So what school are you referring to?" asked Luke, curious. "Nevermore Academy," replied Edgar with a mysterious smile. Luke, who was about to take a bite of a piece of pizza, froze. "What's?" thought Luke. His expression on the outside remained unperturbed. He had heard that name before, 13 years ago and a bit more to be exact, when he died mysteriously. One of the last series he watched was Wednesday. It's about Wednesday Addams, a gothic, shady girl who attends Nevermore Academy while trying to solve a mystery and confront a mad pilgrim returning from the grave. In this series are the outcasts who attend this academy. There are psychics, werewolves, gargoyles, vampires, and several others. He finally found out what world he was in. He never thought he would be in Wednesday's world. The prank of filling the ballroom with shit through the sprinklers he got from this series. In the series, a group of normies do the same thing, but instead of shit they use red paint and ruin the Nevermore Academy dance. "To now that I remember, at Nevermore Academy there's a statue of Edgar Allan Poe," thought Luke. "Why so quiet?" asked Edgar with a strange look on his face. He still hadn't explained anything about the school to him. "It's nothing. It just seemed like a strange name," said Luke, snapping back to reality. "What's the difference between that school and another one?" asked Luke, playing dumb. "Nevermore is an academic institution that educates all kinds of outcasts, vampires, sirens, psychics, gorgons, werewolves, and many more. The perfect place to hone your psychic skills. I was a great student. I even have a statue," Edgar explained with an air of smugness. "My father went to that academy?" asked Luke. "Yes, I accompanied him and trained him just like your grandfather. He was a great psychic, too bad he wasn't strong enough," replied Edgar sadly. "Is your training effective?" "You don't seem like much of a teacher if everyone ends up dying," asked Luke, looking doubtfully at the ghost. "Of course it's effective," exclaimed Edgar indignantly. "Only those dirty Spellman family people made deals with demons," he added with hatred and a vein in his forehead. "Demons? Spellman family," thought Luke. There wasn't much talk of demons in the series. The only thing he could relate to was the mad pilgrim Joseph Crackstone when he came back to life after hundreds of years and had a half-demonic appearance. "It's weird that you hate demons with the stories and tales you used to write," Luke commented. "There are limits to everything. Those who make deals with demons are already against humanity. That idiot Crackstone had to have gone after them," said Edgar. "Or is it true that he made deals with demons?" "Peculiar for a normie," Edgar muttered with a thoughtful look. "What are the demons, and who are the Spellmans?" asked Luke, curious. "I've said too much. By now you should know that you are up against people who have demons on their side, and they are very powerful. You must go to Nevermore and begin your education as soon as possible. We will start training right there," Edgar said, clearing his voice. Luke frowned. The Wednesday series didn't talk about this at all. There was no successor to Poe, or maybe they didn't show him in the episodes. Or he died early. His birth had changed a lot of things. Nevermore is the safest place. They'll accept you right away as soon as they know you're a Poe, Edgar said when he saw that Luke didn't speak. I'll go. Won't it draw attention if I go with the last name Poe? Asked Luke. It wouldn't do any good to draw the attention of his demon-aided pursuers. Yes, but it doesn't matter. It's been 13 years since you were born. Sooner rather than later they'll find you. It's better to be in Nevermore. They won't try to do anything if you're there. Since just like us they are outcasts, they won't attack an outcast academy, Edgar replied. Maybe for a few years they will let me study in peace, but what will I do when I have to leave Nevermore? Most likely if they know I'm there they will have me surrounded and will attack as soon as I leave. Said Luke, you are quite cautious. Don't worry, your father and grandfather were able to escape quietly. I have my ways, said Edgar confidently. If you say so, said Luke, turning his attention back to his rich pizza after finishing his luxurious meal. Luke used the gas station's internet to log on to Google Maps and set himself the route he needed to take to get to Nevermore. He had to travel 210 miles to get to Jericho, the town where Nevermore Academy was located. If he used his bike to get there, it would take him 21 hours. Not counting rest, he would be tank lighter. He had to use public transportation and spend some of the money he had saved. He paid for his pizza and Coke and began his journey to Nevermore Academy. Chapter 6, Jericho. Author's note. Hi everyone, I wanted to clarify that there is no crossover in the story. I only used the last name Spellman because I liked it. That's all. The trip was long, but Luke was enjoying it. It was soothing to watch the scenery while traveling comfortably. The only bad thing was that he didn't have headphones to listen to music. It sucked to be poor. He could have traveled by train, but he decided to pay for a long-distance bus for convenience. Although it was a bit more expensive, it was the first time he had ever indulged in luxury in this life. For this, he was saving all the time he was spending at the orphanage and planning his escape plan. As for his crazy ancestor, he was resting inside the necklace. It seemed he couldn't be out for 24 hours. He had to replenish energy and his time outside was limited. He could go out for about 4 hours. On the trip, Luke thought about many things. In 2 months, he would start his 9th grade year at Nevermore if accepted. According to Edgar, they were going to accept him yes or yes, and it doesn't matter that he ran away from his orphanage. He said that outcasts help each other, and even more so if you have the last name Poe. He also thought about the story that unfolds in the Wednesday series. From what he remembers, Wednesday enters Nevermore at the age of 16, so that would still be 2.5 years away. As she enters in the middle of the year, how strong will Hyde be, thought Luke. Hyde was a horrible monster with great strength and was one of the antagonists of the series. A boy who appeared to be a normie was one and was controlled by the main antagonist. I don't remember his name, but if I see him I should recognize him, Luke thought, looking out the window. Remembering exact things from his past life was much more difficult, and it seemed his photographic memory wasn't entirely effective, though if he tried hard, he might be able to remember it. He must take tests. The first person to unlock the true nature of a Hyde would make him a slave to this person, developing a primal loyalty to him. However, Luke had no plans to do this as long as the main antagonist hadn't already done so. Who wanted to keep a horrible monster as a pet? He'd beat it to a pulp with his powers on sight. The bus he was riding on stopped, and a shout was heard. This will be the last stop. If you want to relieve yourselves or buy something, do it now. Several people started to get off the bus. Luke did too. His butt hurt from sitting for so long. At the stop besides a gas station there were a couple of stores. Luke headed for the bathroom. When he came out he noticed that one of the stores was a bookstore. Let's see how much money I have left, Luke thought, taking out his wallet and starting to count the money. The wallet was old like all his belongings. He stole it from a homeless man in Boston who wanted to rob him. A homeless man wanted to rob an 11-year-old boy. What he didn't expect was that the boy had telekinetic powers. Tough luck for that homeless guy. Since it was night, Luke decided to use his powers. Besides, no one would believe a homeless man was on drugs. $555, not bad at all, Luke thought. Before the trip, he managed to get a few dollars for his bike. As it would be too difficult to take it with him, he decided to go into the bookstore and buy some books to read for the rest of the trip. As he opened the door, he heard a bell. The store manager was an elderly man. He looked at Luke since he was the only customer at this hour. Luke noticed that he looked at him with suspicion, as his looks were not good at all, and it was obvious that he was very young, so it was hard to believe that he had money to buy a book or that with his age he reads books considering the technological age. Hi, I want to buy the book Carrie by Stephen King, said Luke, approaching the counter. This horror book by Stephen King was very famous and was about a girl who awakened her psychic powers because she was being bullied at school. The girl could no longer contain her rage in one last prank, unleashing her powers and ending up with the murder of over 400 people. Luke wondered if Stephen King, like Poe, was an outcast with psychic powers. Most likely he is. Carrie could have been inspired by an outcast living with normies who in the end ended up exploding and murdering everyone. Stephen King. Who is that writer? We don't have any books by him here, said the old man with a puzzled expression. What? You don't know it? Misery, The Shining? Asked Luke, who also had a puzzled look on his face. I don't know what you're talking about, kid. We don't have any of those books here, said the old man, shaking his head. Luke walked out of the bookstore with a strange expression on his face and the Bram Stoker's Dracula book. It cost him $9.99. Wasting no time, he logged onto the gas station's free internet. He googled Stephen King. Nothing came up. No Carrie. Nothing, no way, muttered Luke. Stephen King didn't exist in this world, or at least he hadn't become famous like in his past life. In his past life, Stephen King was equally or more famous than Edgar Allan Poe and considered a master of horror, unlike his actual ancestor Edgar. Stephen King amassed a fortune of approximately $500 million. $500 million. His books were adapted into film and on TV, and they were smash hits and continued to be smash hits. Luke was a big Stephen fan because he lived in an orphanage and saved money. He never decided to buy Stephen books. He now had an unethical thought in his mind. Maybe he shouldn't become a mercenary and misuse his powers to get money. All he should do is copy Stephen King's novels and publish them as if he had written them and become a millionaire. Luke boarded the bus with a smile rarely seen on his face. He had read almost all of Stephen King's novels. The problem was how exactly to remember all the details and how the novel was written. If he were a normal person, it would be impossible to copy them as Stephen King wrote them. But he was not a normal person. He had psychic powers, and his mind was more advanced and complex than that of an ordinary human. I must find a way to remember when I read Stephen's novels, and be able to copy them perfectly, Luke thought. When he is settled in Jericho, he will try some deep meditation to remember things from the past perfectly. He was confident he could pull it off since he has a photographic memory, only in memories of his past life. It didn't work so well. Maybe Edgar has some useful method, Luke thought. Looking at the black metal necklace around his neck, as it was still an hour to Jericho, Luke started reading Bram Stoker's Dracula book. Bram Stoker is a good writer, not as good as me, although we had some similarities, said Edgar Allan Poe, coming out of the necklace and looking at the book in Luke's hands. Were you from the same era? Asked Luke, looking up from the book. Luckily, next to him, he had no one, so he could converse with the ghost of his great-great-grandfather. No, Stoker was just a boy when I died in 1849, but in training my heirs I became acquainted with his works and was able to read them. Edgar replied, Since 1849 you've been training people, and they all die? Asked Luke, looking at the ghost with judging eyes. He didn't seem to be a very good teacher. That was about 170 years or so. Like me, Stoker was not able to live comfortably on his great work. Dracula, his works gained recognition and a lot of money after his death. His heirs made a lot of money because of him. Much like my story, Edgar said, ignoring Luke. Where is my money? I don't have a penny from your inheritance. The only thing I had left was an old house in a neighborhood of hobos and drug addicts. Luke commented with a grimace. My works are over 150 years old. What did you expect, to live off of them? Not have to work more and be a bum all your life? No, young man, you would have been born earlier for that. Blame your parents, grandparents, uncles and so on, not me, Edgar said. Luke said nothing. His crazy ancestor was right. He went back to reading his book, which cost him a lot of money. Reading about Dracula in a world where vampires exist is very different from doing so when you think it's all fiction. Was Dracula a story based on true events? Finally, Luke arrived in Jericho. It's a small rural American town with many stores, boutiques, and notable landmarks dating back to the Pilgrim era. Luke liked the place. It was quaint. He was getting tired of the big city of Boston. It was nice for a change of air in a town that was cleaner and more connected to nature. So what now? I don't think the academy is open. It's vacation, Luke said, looking at Edgar, who was watching Jericho with a nostalgic look on his face. Don't compare Nevermore Academy to the other normie schools. There's always someone working to improve the school and the condition of the outcasts. Let's go. I'm sure we'll find someone, Edgar said, as he led Luke towards the academy. Chapter 7's Outcast Culture. Nevermore Academy was on the outskirts of Jericho. It was a considerable distance as you had to venture through the woods to get there. There was a good road, but Luke didn't have a car. Damn it, I shouldn't have sold the bike, thought Luke as he walked along the edge of the road. How much longer? Asked Luke, waving the necklace around his neck. Don't shake, it makes me dizzy, said Edgar, annoyed as he stepped out of the collar. Damn ghost, while I'm walking to my death, you're resting quietly in the necklace, thought Luke. About 20 or 30 minutes. Maybe more. They upgraded the asphalt. There must be a good director running Nevermore, replied Edgar as he admired the new road. If I'm not mistaken, the director was called Larissa, thought Luke, remembering the tall blonde woman from the series. He was curious as to what Larissa would be like. Would she have the same appearances in the series he saw, the same personality, the same destiny? As for the last one, she is the most malleable, as Luke's interference could change her fate, which is death at the hands of the crazy normie professor. They should put a bus or something, Luke complained. It's summer vacation. What student would come to school? You should improve your physical fitness. Maybe we should start with that, said Edgar, shaking his head. Shut up, I'm only 14, said Luke, justifying himself. A 14-year-old who can't walk a few miles, said Edgar with a slight smirk. Before Luke could start an argument, Edgar spoke again. You turned 14 already? When? He asked. Yesterday. Well, congratulations. How did you have a good time? Asked Edgar. Great. I ran away from the orphanage. I ate a cheap pizza at a urine-smelling gas station while chatting with my ghost great-great-grandfather, Luke replied sarcastically. A peculiar birthday, although it was most likely better than spending it in that orphanage, Edgar commented, and Luke nodded without much enthusiasm. It was the best birthday he's ever had in this new life. Here's to running away from that orphanage. What are the other outcasts like? Asked Luke, curious. Even though he watched the Wednesday series, it didn't explain much since it was only one season. As for powers, he didn't know much either. Wednesday, the main character, only had visions when she touched an object or person. It didn't seem like a big deal compared to flipping over a 2-ton pickup truck. He doesn't know anything. Well, that's to be expected. He grew up in a normie orphanage, thought Edgar. There are many kinds of outcasts. You're a psychic, thanks to the Poe family, who are all psychics, replied Edgar. Is that good? Asked Luke. Yes, and very much so. Psychics are among the strongest of the outcasts, and they're a minority. At first, they may be outclassed in strength by other outcasts like werewolves, but their potential is much greater, replied Edgar. Luke nodded. If he could control the power he showed when he flipped the 2-ton truck, a werewolf would be a piece of cake. He could stop him with his eyes alone or crush him with super heavy objects. As for Hyde, he's not sure of his strength or weight. Maybe it weighs more or has a strength that can't be stopped by a 2-ton psychic power. What about psychics that have visions or are more into prophecies? They would be very weak, Luke asked. Although Wednesday was a case apart because she was an expert martial artist. If you only specialized in that area in combat, you would be very weak, but your visions would be very powerful. You could consider yourself more of a support psychic. You won't fight a werewolf face to face, replied Edgar. Specialize? Asked Luke, confused. I'll explain later. It's a lengthy subject. First, you have to be accepted into Nevermore and find a safe place to stay, Edgar said. Luke nodded. There seemed to be a lot he didn't know about this world of outcasts and monsters. By the way, what if a vampire has a child with a psychic? Will the baby be a vampire and a psychic at the same time? Asked Luke. This way you would have the advantages of 2 different types of outcasts. You could move things with your mind and at the same time have a longer lifespan. For example, the odds of the baby having the abilities of each parent is very low. Generally, only one gene prevails, the psychic or the vampire gene, not both. However, the baby will have a weaker gene than a baby born to 2 psychic parents or 2 vampire parents. This would not happen if they were both psychic or vampire, replied Edgar. Oh, that's why there are outcast tribes, Luke said with a thoughtful look. Exactly. Not only are there differences between attitudes and beliefs in each outcast group, although if you're lucky enough to have your baby born a vampire and psychic, it will be very powerful. But the odds are low, Edgar said. Blood purity. It reminds me a bit of the Harry Potter books, although there the half-bloods could be the most powerful, thought Luke with an odd expression. What if an outcast has a baby with a normie? Asked Luke. Baby has a 50-50 chance of being born an outcast or a normie. If he's an outcast, he'll have weaker potential than if both his parents had been outcasts. I don't see it as a bad thing, though. Love always triumphs, Edgar replied, stroking his strange mustache. Luke looked at him strangely. It was strange that a ghost who every 5 minutes had a macabre smile and wanted to get revenge in the most horrible ways possible was talking about how love always triumphs. I thought you didn't like normies, Luke said, as he had noticed certain attitudes of Edgar's that seemed to look down on normies. There are certain attitudes of your society that I don't share. Also, they always excluded us and treated us as outcasts. But I don't detest them. I can converse and live with them, if they are willing to do so. I am not like them, said Edgar. After all, his literary works became famous in the Nornu world. As outcasts are in the minority, there are two kinds of ideals in the outcast community. It has nothing to do with tribes, it has to do with how we view and treat normies, Edgar replied as he made the symbol 2 with his right hand. The first and most is found here is that the outcasts are willing to coexist with the normies. Although they have their differences and may act distant or distrustful towards them, they are willing to live together and be at peace. The Poe family would be in that group, Edgar explained. The second are the outcasts who loathe and hate to unimaginable scales the normies. If they can kill, torture, or capture them, they will. They do not want peace, nor do they want to live with them. Because of this extremist group, there has always been tension between the two communities, and the normies used to go on witch hunts in ancient times. Edgar added, and they never achieved their goal of exterminating the normies, asked Luke, curious. That task in itself is very difficult. You have to keep in mind that the normie population far outnumbers the fringe. In itself, the extremist outcasts are already a minority in the outcast community itself. So it is very difficult to exterminate all normies. Besides, there is always one or another outcast who decides to help the normies, and the normies know how to defend themselves to some extent, Edgar replied. Their chance is gone. Now it is more difficult to exterminate the normies who possess military armaments and atomic bombs. Thought Luke, the best time to accomplish this was in ancient times. Although with their powers they could try to control the normie community and try to destroy it with the very weapons they created. Which group is the Spellman family in? Asked Luke, who wanted to know what ideals their enemies had. Although he already had a hunch, to the eyes of the world in the first, but they are actually in the second group, replied Edgar without giving any more information. I guessed as much, thought Luke with a grimace. It was obvious that his enemies would be extreme supremacists who wanted to exterminate the normies. They kept walking as Luke asked questions about the outcast world, and Edgar patiently answered, "Let's finish history class for today," said Edgar, gesturing forward with his chin. Between the tall trees was a tall fence that read Nevermore Academy. On either side were 2 columns of ancient stones with a lantern on each and a stone fence. The perfect school for emos, Luke thought. Although he was somewhat excited to witness the school he saw in the show, he wasn't all that enthusiastic either. The idea of being in an educational center did not appeal to him. If he didn't have serial killers looking for him, he wouldn't have come to Nevermore, perhaps just for tourism. With his great-great-grandfather as a mentor, he could already train his psychic abilities more efficiently. He didn't need to come to an academy boarding school and share day-to-day life with insufferable teenagers, although he was one himself. Although they were outcast teens, Luke, watching Wednesday's series, found no difference between the teens at Nevermore and a regular school. The groups, the popular school activities, and the same old bullshit. The only difference was that there were teens with powers and slightly more bizarre behavior. He might sound very emo, even if he didn't want to admit it. You don't look very happy, Edgar said, looking at Luke's expression. He didn't look like a typical student happy to see his new school and the adventures he would spend there. No, I am very happy. My happiness is so much that I forgot how to smile, said Luke as he walked towards the big gate. Chapter 8. Principal Larissa Weems. When he was closer to the gate, Luke heard a soft creaking sound. The gate opened by itself slowly. Well, thanks, thought Luke without giving it much thought. As he crossed the threshold, he heard the creak again. The gate closed. On the path that was now part of Nevermore Academy, he came across columns that had creepy gorgons that seemed to be following him with their eyes. After about 10 minutes of walking, he finally caught sight of the Gothic architecture of Nevermore Academy. It was gigantic and very creepy looking. What do you think? Asked Edgar with a smile, looking at the imposing academy. Creepy, Luke said dryly. The school was surrounded by another fence and there was another gate. The bad thing was that this gate was locked and didn't open automatically when Luke approached it. He tried to open it manually, but it wouldn't budge. What now? Asked Luke. Look, there's someone in there, said Edgar, pointing toward the inside of Nevermore Academy. Luke looked through the bars of the gate, and sure enough, there was a bald, hunched-over man with his back to him. He had a broom and was sweeping leaves. The bald man's clothing was black and dirty. His shoes looked to be in worse condition than Luke's. Hi, hey you. Hello, called Luke, raising his voice. The bald man didn't flinch no matter how many times Luke called out to him repeatedly. He was still sweeping leaves as if nothing had happened. Is this bald guy deaf? Asked Luke in a high-pitched tone. Who are you calling bald? The bald man exclaimed angrily as he turned around and looked at Luke. No one, you must have heard wrong. I would never say something like that, said Luke with an innocent smile. I may be blind in one eye, but my ears are in perfect condition, said the bald man. walking over and looking at Luke through the bars. "And why didn't you turn around when I called you earlier?" Luke thought with a roll of his eyes. Luke noticed two bulging eyes looking at him. The eyes were different colors. One was a chestnut color, and the other was a light, almost white color. The look of this bald one was creepy. It matched well with the academy's looks. "Whatever you say, Baldy. By the way, are there any school personnel here today? If there aren't, how do I contact them?" asked Luke impatiently. Sniff, sniff, sniff. The bald man sniffed through the bars near Luke, who looked at him in disgust. "You smell like Normie. You better get out of here, kid. You don't want to get hurt." "This school isn't for your type," said the bald man, flashing a creepy grin with a couple of teeth missing. "Should I break his leg with the rock over there? That way he'll see I'm a psychic." Luke thought seriously. "Don't hurt the school staff, or you'll be expelled before you start," said Edgar, noticing the mischievous look on Luke's face. "Gee," clicked Luke's tongue internally, just as he was about to demonstrate his psychic powers in a harmless way to let the bald guy know he wasn't a normie. Someone spoke up, getting his attention. "What's going on here, Willie? What's all the fuss about?" It was a female voice. Both the bald man and Luke looked at the new person who appeared. She was a very tall woman, about 6 feet tall. Her hair was blonde, almost white, and she had blue eyes. Her dress was very professional, and she looked very expensive, very different from the bald guy named Willie. "Director Weems, nothing that deserves your attention, just a normie boy who got lost," Willie said politely, very different from when he spoke to Luke. "The normie boy," thought Weems quizzically. It was rare for normies from Jericho to visit Nevermore Academy, since Jericho citizens are prejudiced about the school and its students. Weems' goal as principal of Nevermore was to create a world where outcasts and normies could coexist in peace and harmony. So she was always trying to promote activities that would help this. Weems, with this in mind, couldn't let the normie kid go to Jericho seeing creepy, weird janitor Willie. It could get bad rumors going. "Hello, boy. My name is Larissa Weems. I'm the principal of Nevermore. You seem to have walked all the way here. Would you like me to give you a lift into town?" asked Larissa as she unlocked the gate with an old key. Luke was surprised at how polite Larissa sounded and how kind she was to offer to catch him up to town, but there seemed to be a misunderstanding. "Oh, it's that brat Larissa. I thought I looked familiar with that pale blonde gentlewoman," Edgar said next to Luke, who decided to ignore him, as he couldn't talk to a ghost right now. "Nice to meet you, Principal Weems. There's a bit of a misunderstanding. I'm not a normie, I'm an outcast," Luke said as he looked at the headmistress, who looked just like she did in the Wednesday series. "Don't believe him, Principal. This brat likes to lie. I smelled him repeatedly. He has a normie smell," said Willie. "At no time did I lie." "You're bald and I'm an outcast," Luke said with a grimace. This bald guy wanted to look for trouble with him, not to blame him if he was rude. Before Willie could burst out and start ranting at Luke, Larissa interrupted him. "It's okay, Willie, go clean up the backyard. There's a lot of leaves piled up," she said. Willie huffed in annoyance, glared at Luke, and walked off with his broom, grumbling. When Willie disappeared, Larissa looked back at Luke. "You say you're an outcast. What kind exactly, if I may ask?" Larissa asked curiously. "In the outcast world, there is no taboo about what kind of outcast you are, unless you are a Hyde, as you have no control and can murder those around you." "A psychic," replied Luke as he looked at a small stone near his shoes. The stone started to float until it reached the height of his head. He made it spin around him a couple of times, down up, drawing a circle until it landed softly on the ground. "Oh, a psychic with a specialization in telekinesis. Psychics are not very numerous," Larissa said in surprise. "Again with the specialization thing," Luke thought, not understanding what she meant. "You're not a student here. Did your family send you to a normie school?" Larissa asked curiously. Not all outcasts decided to send their children to outcast schools, as there were very few of them, so if they lived too far away, they would send them to normie schools and teach them about their powers themselves. "Yes and no. I went to a normie school, but I don't have a family. I'm an orphan," Luke replied. "What?" murmured Larissa with much surprise. "A psychic in a normie orphanage?" This was very odd. Outcasts were in the minority as far as normies were concerned, and psychics were a minority in the outcast community itself. What was the chance of a psychic ending up in a normie orphanage? That's what Larissa was thinking. Besides, Luke's abilities showed great control, even though he only lifted a single stone. "What's your name?" asked Larissa, and her lower lip quivered. She moved closer to Luke and looked at him more closely. What's wrong with her all of a sudden? thought Luke, surprised by the change in the headmistress's attitude. "Luke," he replied. "Your full name?" hurried Larissa. "Luke Poe. You're her son." "No doubt about it, you have her eyes and the same color hair," said Larissa in shock as with her hands she touched Luke's cheeks. Luke didn't know how to react. The situation was not what he had originally expected. He had in mind that the headmistress would be surprised by his last name, but not so much to the point that she seemed to know his parents and was on the verge of tears. "Did you know my parents?" asked Luke as best he could since Larissa was inspecting him, checking to see if he was real or a ghost. "Yes, to both of them. All three of us attended Nevermore in the same year. I was closer to your mother," replied Larissa, wiping away tears that were about to spill from her eyes. "I didn't expect this," Luke thought. "It looks like the Poe family will survive. It's a miracle," said Larissa happily. "Follow me. We have a lot of things to talk about, and you most likely have many questions," added Larissa, starting to walk in the direction of the academy. Luke nodded and followed the principal, who had a shocked expression, happy, sad, and many emotions seemed to contain her face. "Why didn't you ever tell me you were pregnant? It's no use thinking about it. Now I must take care of her child," Larissa thought with determination. Chapter 9 Talk with Larissa. Luke was currently in Principal Weem's office having tea. In the office near the entrance is a large bear by the door. The director's desk is located in front of large windows. There is also a large fireplace with a gorgon face opening its mouth. Since it is summer, the fireplace is not lit. There were many lamps and dim lighting. Larissa was sitting in a large leather chair with wheels, and on the other side of the desk sat Luke sipping the delicious tea. "I know you must have a lot of questions, but let me get started if it's not too much trouble," Larissa said, looking at Luke, who nodded. He didn't mind too much. He didn't have that many questions about his parents either. Edgar had already told her everything he needed to know. He may even know more than Larissa, who was unaware of their existence. "What is the name of your orphanage and what is its location?" asked Larissa as she opened her MacBook. "Orphanage Always Happy in Boston, Massachusetts," Luke replied. "Boston? How is that possible? The Poe house is located there," thought Larissa with surprise as she began to Google the orphanage. Larissa continued to ask and Luke answered while sipping tea and some nice cookies. He didn't think it was a bad deal to give up his personal information for free food. Anyway, this information didn't matter much anymore. According to Edgar, even if Larissa knows he ran away from his orphanage and was expelled from 3 schools, she will help him because he is an outcast and was friends with his mother. Who knew that Larissa's brat is now the principal of Nevermore Academy? "Time flies," Edgar said in surprise as he watched Larissa use her MacBook. Luke didn't respond. He guessed that Edgar, while training his father, met Larissa, who was a friend of his mother. "There's nothing. There's no record, not at the orphanage, not at the previous schools he went to, not even the one where he was expelled," Larissa thought with a frown. She had done some quick research and had no record of Luke Poe. Someone had hidden Luke's identity. Although from what Luke told, his last name was not unknown to the people at the orphanage or the school. Why did they cover up Luke's identity, and who helped them do it? Thought Larissa with many questions in her head. She was hurt that her friend hid from her that she had a child and many more things. She knew that Poe's death was not a normal accident. However, they never told her anything. "So, you played a practical joke at your previous school, and since you didn't want to carry out the punishment, you ran away from the orphanage and want to join Nevermore Academy, right?" asked Larissa, looking at Luke. "Yes, living with normies is very difficult. I'm afraid they'll piss me off and then they end up with a broken limb or worse," said Luke, taking a sip of tea quietly. What he was saying was the truth. At this time, he did not want to break the leg of the bullies with his telekinetic powers. Who would find out? He could wait for the right moment and make it look like an accident so it wouldn't be so surreal when his leg bent out of nowhere. Or maybe as he walks down the stairs, give him a little telekinetic shove and let it be what God wills. In a normal world, it would be impossible to get caught. He was always tempted to do it, but he controlled himself. Splendid self-control. If Luke could say so, anyone in his situation would have already revenged himself by using the powers, but he decided to use a normie and harmless prank. He started to see Brad and the other bullies as annoying flies, but if they bother him over and over again, they can get to piss him off. He's still a human after all. He doesn't want to end up like Stephen King's Carrie by murdering over 400 people. If he alone survives, he could be suspected and would be hunted like a criminal all over the United States. Very annoying. After all, outcasts are known to exist, even if not all normies believe in them, although he didn't know he was in Wednesday's world when he thought about these things. Luke explained this to the director, who was listening intently. He seems to be more concerned about the aftermath than the deaths themselves. Well, the Poe family members were always peculiar, Larissa thought. Your self-control is very good, you're right. It's hard to control yourself in normie schools, where your powers bursting out can be dangerous. That's why there's Nevermore. You remind me of John, said Larissa. My father, asked Luke. His father's name was John Poe. Yes, John always weighed his decisions on a scale. What will the consequences be if I do this? If he could face them, he would make the decision no matter how dangerous the consequences might be, replied Larissa with a strange smile. Hey, don't treat me like a psycho, Luke thought indignantly. From Larissa's words, it seemed that his self-control was only because of the consequences if he fatally injured or killed a person. On second thought, it was true. Although he could kill Brad and the bullies in discreet ways with his powers, there was always the possibility that someone would know he was the killer. Before, he didn't know what world he was in, so he always had that doubt and caution about using his powers. With today's cell phones, there were cameras everywhere. If out of nowhere Brad's neck was snapped, videos could go all over the world, or if he was pushed out of the school window by a mysterious wind. However, if he didn't care about the consequences and went with his powers, he wouldn't get that far, or so he thinks. He'd just break both of Brad's legs, so he'd have to push a wheelchair for the rest of his life. I would just give him a punishment for his attitude. You reap what you sow. I wouldn't go so far as to take his life, Luke said calmly. That'd better be the case. Killing normies won't help the outcasts at all. How did you find Nevermore? Asked Larissa. I went into my parents' old house and found information about the outcasts in Nevermore there, Luke replied. He wouldn't tell him about the existence of the chattering ghost or the memories of his past life. You wouldn't think it's all fake, a simple tale? Asked Larissa. If it was a normie, I would see it as fanciful, but since I have powers, I thought it might be real, replied Luke. It wouldn't be logical to think that he would be the only human with powers, although in reality he was 100% sure about the existence of the academy. From what Edgar told him, normies have limited knowledge about the existence of outcasts. Most believe that vampires, werewolves, gorgons, and other types of outcasts are myths and urban legends. The lack of hard evidence and the absence of significant interactions between the outcasts and normies have contributed to the perception that it is all part of the collective imagination. However, some towns, such as Jericho, have had close encounters with these beings and are more informed than the normal population. The lack of widespread knowledge creates an atmosphere of uncertainty and mystery in normal society. This allows the marginals to mingle among them without being easily detected. As most normies consider their stories to be just that, unsubstantiated stories, this lack of knowledge can also lead to misunderstanding and prejudice when the two groups interact, as ignorance can breed fear and mistrust. So, there is always tension between the two groups. Someone who sees two outcasts talking about werewolves, the moon, and things like that, would see them as weirdos, rather than thinking that they are werewolves. I understand, registration isn't open yet, but I'll take care of the paperwork. Don't worry about that. As for you running away from the orphanage, I will contact them and make the necessary arrangements so you can stay here without any problems, said Larissa. So easy, thought Luke in surprise. It seems his mother's relationship with Larissa was very good. How Edgar knew Larissa from his parents' school days. He knew the headmistress wasn't lying. Sorry for the inconvenience. Another thing, now that I'll be living here in Jericho, I'll need a place to stay, and for that, I'll need money. Can you recommend any jobs? Asked Luke hopefully. With his meager savings, he would not be able to afford a mortgage on real estate. Since Larissa was the director, she seemed to have a lot of connections. In the series, he remembered she seemed to have a lot of money. Maybe he'll find a high-paying job because of her. Before Larissa could answer, someone knocked on the door. Knock, knock. Come in, said Larissa, raising her voice. The door was opened and Luke saw the bald man named Willie. What is it? Asked Larissa impatiently. A person is waiting. She wants to talk to you. She says it has to do with the brat, replied Willie. It was strange that on a summer vacation day, they should have two visitors. Larissa at first would have told Willie that she couldn't at this time and the person had to make an appointment before showing up at school. But upon hearing that it was Luke, she told Willie to have that person come in. Luke didn't have a good feeling about this. What person in this world would seek him out? There was only one option, and it was the right one. The person who walked in was a middle-aged woman with black hair and some gray hair. Luke recognized her within seconds. How did she find me so quickly? Luke thought, looking at the woman who was Bethany Miller, the orphanage caretaker who took care of Luke and the other children. Chapter 10. Maid, do you two know each other? Asked Larissa as she noticed Bethany and Luke staring at each other. Yes, I was the one who raised this smelly brat, said Bethany, looking at Luke with a frown. Me and dozens of other smelly brats, Luke said, emphasizing this point since she wasn't his mother. She was only the matron of the orphanage, and their relationship went no further than that. Oh, you must be Bethany Miller, the orphanage caretaker, said Larissa, nodding her head. You know me? Asked Bethany with surprise. Luke mentioned you, and I found you in the information there about the Always Happy Orphanage, replied Larissa as she settled back in her chair. The internet, muttered Bethany with a barely visible grimace. Anyway, I came here to take Luke. He needs to go back to the orphanage, said Bethany in a forceful tone. Why do you take your job so seriously? Thought Luke in annoyance. I'm not going back. I've already found a better school. Even though I'm a minor, I should be able to choose where I study, right? Asked Luke without backing down. You should take responsibility for your actions, Luke. You filled a giant classroom with shit. You need to clean it up and take the punishment. That way you won't get expelled, said Bethany. I would take responsibility for my actions if the school wouldn't turn a deaf ear to complaints about Brad and his friends. They can do what they want, and I don't see them taking responsibility for their actions, said Luke, crossing his arms. Mrs. Miller, I don't think it's a good idea to send Luke against his will to a school he doesn't want to attend. It would be counterproductive, said Larissa. Yes, if you make me come back when school starts, I'll make another prank on the same level. I'll repeat them as many times as it takes until I'm expelled, said Luke with a confident smile. He had Larissa on his side, the principal of an academic institution and a woman with a lot of money. Bethany looked at Luke with a frown. Luke felt a shiver run through his entire body. Since when did Mrs. Miller have that aura? It's good excitement, Luke, but it would be better if we can talk it out and come to an agreement like civilized people, Larissa said with a slight smile as she looked at Bethany. You don't understand, Luke. You need to go back. I have legal custody of you, and I know what's best for you, Bethany said without backing down. Legal custody? That's playing dirty, Luke thought with a grimace. He was still a minor, and he also didn't know perfectly how the laws worked on orphan minors. You're indeed his legal guardian, but Luke is already 14. As an orphan, he has a certain degree of autonomy, especially in his education, Larissa said with a slight smile, not shuddering at the legality in this case. As the headmistress of an educational institution, she knew the laws very well. That's it, attack, thought Luke with more relief. It was good to have a powerful ally from time to time. On the other hand, I looked up Luke's records from the orphanage and school and found nothing. That's odd. Do you have any knowledge of this, Mrs. Miller? Added Larissa. I don't know what you're talking about, Bethany replied. Luke's last name is quite peculiar and famous. He should know the famous writer and poet Edgar Allan Poe, right? Said Larissa, and Bethany nodded with a frown. Turns out Luke has the same last name. Look here, it says so, continued Larissa as she showed Bethany a document where Luke's name, date of birth, and time of birth were recorded, the parents' names and several other pieces of information. How did she get this? Wondered Bethany in surprise as she took the document. Then looked at Luke, who smiled triumphantly at her. Luke came prepared to Nevermore Academy. Who would believe him if he said he was a descendant of Edgar Allan Poe? He couldn't just take his word for it, so he had previously managed to get a copy of his birth certificate. The copy he had obtained for a different purpose. Since he planned to leave the orphanage, he needed a document to validate his identity, since it is essential for several purposes, above all, identification and access to medical services in case of emergency. Although being an orphan who ran away from home, once he goes to the hospital he should run away in no time before he gets caught, but at the very least he would be covered on some essentials. On this document you can verify that you are a descendant of Edgar Allan Poe. Luke's parents attended this school. Did you know that? Said Larissa, but Bethany did not respond. I find two things strange. First, there is no information on Luke even though there is a birth certificate, and second, this birth certificate is the original. And it was in your possession, Larissa said, looking at Bethany with narrowed eyes. The original? Thought Luke in confusion. He had thought he had stolen a copy, and what did Larissa mean about there being no information about him? What's the problem with me possessing the original? Asked Bethany. The original birth certificate is always on file at the registrar's office. The orphanage should possess a copy, not the original. You as his legal guardian seem to be trying to hide Luke's identity, replied Larissa. Ms. Bethany wants to hide my identity? Thought Luke in confusion. Damn normies and their stupid procedures, cursed Bethany in a low tone, but it was heard by Larissa and Luke, who had his eyes wide open. Since when did Ms. Bethany curse like she was a teenager? More importantly, did she say normies? If I remember correctly, you're Natasha, right? Asked Larissa with a nostalgic expression. With an annoyed sigh, Bethany closed her eyes, and her body began to tremble slightly. Her wrinkles smoothed out and the gray hair faded in a matter of seconds. Her bones creaked softly as she shrank a few inches. Suddenly, the middle-aged woman became smaller and more delicate, transforming before Luke's shocked eyes. Larissa was not surprised. When Bethany, or rather Natasha, opened her eyes, they were now a steely blue. Her black hair had turned red and reached her shoulders. Her complexion was slimmer than when she was transformed into Bethany. The shapeshifts, thought Luke, dumbfounded, looking at the young woman in front of his eyes. The old woman had transformed into a beauty in her mid-30s at most. He never imagined that the caretaker of his orphanage was an outcast and a shapeshifter. Also, she seemed to know him, since she hid his details. "Oh, it's Natasha's brat. Look how much she's grown. She was always glued to your mother," Edgar said, stroking his mustache. "Why are they all brats to you?" thought Luke, looking sideways at the ghost, who was already pissing him off because he seemed to know everyone. Then he looked back at the redhead named Natasha. A Marvel character popped into his head. The Black Widow. They even had the same name, and their appearance was similar. "You hid Luke's data?" asked Larissa in a serious tone. Natasha nodded reluctantly. "Why? Why didn't Sophie ever tell me she had a son, and what exactly happened to them? I thought you were dead too, since you never showed up," said Larissa, asking several questions she had been holding back for a long time. "My mother," thought Luke, reacting to the name Sophie. The problems of the Poe family should be solved by the Poe family. If Mistress Sophie didn't tell you anything, it's because she either didn't trust you or didn't want to put you in danger, replied Natasha without further explanation. "You're from my family?" asked Luke. "Maybe they were cousins or something." "I'm the housekeeper for the Poe family," replied Natasha, looking at Luke with a blank look on her face. "So she's some kind of family butler, like Lurch from the Addams family," Luke thought with a strange expression. Lurch is the Addams family servant, who usually communicates through simple inarticulate moans. He looks like some sort of slightly smaller Frankenstein. "Now that you've come to Nevermore Academy, you're in danger. They must know your movements by now." "Oh. Why are you always so irresponsible, reckless, rebellious?" said Natasha, whining and scolding Luke. "What kind of maid treats his master like that?" thought Luke. "The safest option is to come to Nevermore Academy. For 13 years I managed to stay safe. But sooner or later they would find me," said Luke after Natasha stopped complaining. "Oh, he must be in contact with Lord Edgar's ghost by now," thought Natasha, as she tried to guess if the ghost was in the room or not. Edgar just told Luke that Natasha is trustworthy and there's no need to hide from him that she doesn't know anything about his situation. Besides, thanks to her he managed to stay hidden for 13 years. "Would they find you?" "Who?" asked Larissa. "No one. Luke will be starting 9th grade at Nevermore Academy. I'll take care of getting all the proper paperwork to you. Now we need to find a safe place to stay in Jericho," said Natasha, placing her delicate hand on her chin. "What about the orphanage?" asked Luke. "I will leave it after I have all the necessary papers for you to attend Nevermore," replied Natasha. "They will still have legal custody of me. I hope they won't cause any more problems," murmured Luke, who wanted to come of age as soon as possible. "Don't worry about that. I have your legal custody. If you want, you can call me Mommy from now on," said Natasha with a smirk as she patted Luke's head. "Don't bother," snorted Luke, pulling his hand away from Natasha, who was looking at him mockingly. He never thought a maid could be so annoying. After that, Larissa offered Natasha an apartment near Jericho's main square. Natasha accepted. She didn't seem to have any money problems. The orphanage was falling apart for a reason. Natasha had stolen funds for her long-term goals without any normies noticing. A very dangerous and unethical practice. Luke had to stay overnight in a hotel for 2 days until Natasha had everything ready and they could move into the apartment. The apartment, in addition to its good location, was very quaint. It had 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a dining room. The dining room floor was polished wood and the walls were painted in soft tones. The kitchen was compact but functional, with granite countertops and modern appliances. Luke's room was an ideal size. He had missed having a room to himself. It had only a single bed and a bedside table. It was empty, but he didn't mind. "At last a room all to myself," thought Luke, throwing himself into the comfortable bed. The only downside would be having to live with the annoying and irritable maid, Natasha. It was strange to think that she was his orphanage nurturer for 13 years, and he never noticed anything unusual about her, especially when she was protecting him from the Spellman family. Since coming to Jericho everything was easier. He thought he would have to get a job to be able to rent something. But that was not the case. The paperwork to get started in Nevermore was super easy. It was all in the hands of Larissa and Natasha. Chapter 11. Aura. "Wake up, brat," yelled Natasha, opening the door to Luke's room. The redhead turned on the lights and opened the blinds, allowing sunlight to enter the entire room. "Don't bother," muttered Luke, putting a pillow over his head to protect himself from the sudden illumination. Natasha forcefully pulled the pillow away from Luke. She then began pillow punching the boy. "WAKUP," uttered Natasha. With each letter came a loud smack on Luke's face. "I'll be right up, shit," shouted Luke in exasperation as he shot to his feet. "Breakfast will be up in 5 minutes. "Be quick," said Natasha, leaving the room. "This unbearable woman," thought Luke, starting the day off on the wrong foot. At the orphanage, he couldn't sleep because of how noisy the other kids were, and now he had a maid waking him up at 10 in the morning on vacation. However, he now had a house that he only had to share with the unbearable maid. This is a situation 1,000 times better than living in an orphanage sharing a room and bathroom with dozens of children. After brushing his face and teeth, he sat at the table while Natasha finished preparing breakfast. Sitting at the table, he could smell the delicious smell of the food the redhead was preparing. In a few minutes, Natasha put in front of Luke a plate with fried eggs, bacon, and American pancakes with orange juice. Luke drooled at the sight of the delicious breakfast. Not so unbearable anymore, Luke thought, looking at Natasha sitting across from him. Natasha was wearing a tight black muscle top that showed off the prominence of her cleavage. Her cool blue eyes and stoic expression of confidence gave the figure a cool beauty. She's very attractive and akin to the Black Widow, thought Luke, putting a piece of bacon in his mouth and examining Natasha, who felt herself being watched, and their gaze met. Luke couldn't deny that he felt a little nervous being watched by Natasha's blue eyes. It was strange that this beauty had taken care of dozens of children for 13 years. Besides, how old was she since she started babysitting at the orphanage? 15 years, a little more or a little less. Stop staring at me and eat, Natasha said in a cold tone. I'm eating, said Luke with his mouth full and not taking his eyes off Natasha, who was slightly surprised. Usually men stammer when talking to her, and more so if it was a brat who was going through puberty and had his hormones out of control. If you stare so hard at girls, you'll scare them away. You won't get a girlfriend that way, Natasha said with a slight provocative smile. Girlfriend, thought Luke. He'd never had a girlfriend, not in his past life nor so far in this life. However, in his past life he died at 13, a rather premature age. Did he have to fall in love with a woman to get a girlfriend? He read many novels and thought he could never feel that feeling. He saw it too far away. I can give you some tips on how to get a girlfriend. It's important that you prepare yourself before you start at Nevermore Academy, said Natasha with a playful smile. No thanks, said Luke with a grimace, knowing that Natasha was just teasing him. A maid making fun of her master is very strange. What do you know about the Spellman family? Asked Luke. He wanted to know more about their mortal enemies. His stubborn great-great-grandfather didn't want to tell him more about them. Lord Edgar will tell you that information in due time. Besides, he knows more than I do, replied Natasha dryly. Why so mysterious? It doesn't matter if I find out now or later, said Luke. If it doesn't matter, be patient and wait, said Natasha, and Luke cursed under his breath. You should start training your psychic powers with Lord Edgar. I will train you physically. I will teach you how to fight, said Natasha. Train physically, asked Luke with disdain. What good is it to fight and be physically stronger if with his telekinetic powers, he can crush a person before they get close to him? It's no good relying solely on your powers. Even if you can flip a van 4x4, you can find yourself in peculiar situations, Natasha said with a slight smile. Roll over a 4x4 van? That was a very specific piece of information. Brad and his family okay? Asked Luke, curious. After he overturned the van and fled, he never heard from them again. But it seems Natasha, who would have retraced their steps, did know. They're alive with a few broken bones and the odd injury, but nothing fatal. An incomplete job, I must say, Natasha replied with eyes that gave off murderous intent. She knew about the people that bothered Luke. If she didn't have to go unnoticed, she would have disappeared them a long time ago. Then complete work, she wanted me to murder Brad and the others, thought Luke with a strange look on his face. Anyway, you'll have to train with me. It's non-negotiable. In the mornings you will train your psychic powers with Lord Edgar. In the afternoons you will train with me. I'll get that skinny body in shape, Natasha said with a smile and a look at Luke that could be misinterpreted. What about the vacations? Asked Luke. He finally had a house and could laze around all he wanted, but now he seemed to have a demanding routine. After you finish in the evenings, you'll have the whole day off. Now go and have Lord Edgar give you your first lesson. I'll clean up, Natasha said, and Luke nodded as he got up from the table and went back to his room. I look like the servant, thought Luke, closing the door to his room. Anyway, he would accept Natasha's demands. She was the person who was providing him with a roof over his head, cooking him delicious food and not requiring him to work. He could endure a physical training routine with her. Since the psychic training, he was planning to do it anyway. Luke sat comfortably on his bed and picked up the necklace resting on his bedside table. Come on out, great-great-grandfather. It's time to wake up, he said as he rudely shook the necklace. Be more careful, cried Edgar as his ghostly figure stepped out of the necklace and floated into the air. That was woken up more aggressively, thought Luke. I'm sorry, can we start the psychic training at once? Asked Luke after falsely apologizing. This brat, in his tone there is no regret whatsoever, thought Edgar, annoyed. It's about time you trained your psychic powers and used them in the most effective way possible," said Edgar as he cleared his throat. "Well, first you should know that psychic abilities are governed by the interaction of two main elements, aura and focus. First, we'll start with the aura," Edgar began, as Luke nodded in agreement. The aura represents the unique psychic energy of each individual and is the life force that drives psychic abilities. Each person has a different aura in terms of color, intensity, and patterns. The color of the aura indicates an individual's psychic specialty, Edgar explained. "Color, intensity, and patterns. How can you tell that?" asked Luke, who was surprised by what he was hearing. He didn't think there would be such a thing in this world. Common knowledge among psychics. For example, if you had common knowledge, would know that you possess a yellow aura. People with yellow auras have an affinity for telekinesis. You have already demonstrated the ability to move objects. "A clear example of basic telekinesis," Edgar replied. "Oh, that's what Principal Larissa meant by specializing in telekinesis," thought Luke, understanding several things. So, they only put the colors in to classify the auras, not because they could see them. Luke commented, "No, the classification was done by psychics who can see your aura. These psychics have a white aura, which means powers in clairvoyance. One of the abilities allows them the ability to see people's auras. They can perceive the colors and energetic patterns emanating from each individual. They can also see their aura," Edgar explained calmly. "What? That ability is so broken," Luke said with surprise. He could know what powers his enemy had before the battle began, which would give him a huge advantage. "That's right, it's a big advantage. Besides, it's only one of the clairvoyance abilities," said Edgar, stroking his mustache. "What other colors are there?" asked Luke very curiously. Edgar began to explain. "So far, counting yellow and white, there were 8 colors of aura. Blue indicates an affinity for telepathy. Red indicates an affinity for emotional manipulation. Violet is associated with visions of the past, present, or future. Green symbolizes the ability for psychic healing, a kind of healing magic. Orange is linked to elemental manipulation. Finally, black is associated with darkness." "Whoa. Yeah, there's a lot of it," commented Luke. He had thought his abilities to move heavy objects were the best, but he had underestimated the psychic powers of this world. "You should know that telekinetic abilities are not just limited to moving objects with your mind," Edgar said, and Luke nodded. He had already used his telekinetic powers for something else besides moving objects with his mind. He had manipulated telekinetic waves to create a psychic blast, a sort of invisible blade that allowed him to cut things with a quick movement of his hand. "Can't you develop another kind of aura?" asked Luke hopefully. "It would be great to have telepathic, clairvoyant, or elemental manipulation powers." "No, the aura you are born with is the one you stay with. It's genetic," Edgar replied, and Luke put on a droopy expression. "He can flip a 2-ton pickup truck, and he wants more power," thought Edgar, looking strangely at Luke. The milestone of flipping a 4x4 pickup truck was rare in the outcast community. Few, if any, psychics demonstrated such power at that age. However, you can have more than one aura when you are born. "It all depends on chance," Edgar said, and Luke's expression brightened. "Usually, the child of 2 psychics will be born with the aura of one of their parents. In rare cases, it may be born with the aura of both. It would be 1 in hundreds of thousands. It's very difficult, but there's still the remote possibility," Edgar said, and Luke's expression darkened again. 1 in hundreds of thousands. What chance was that in the outcast community that had a low population? It was better not to get his hopes up. "What auras did my parents have?" asked Luke. "You inherited your father's yellow aura. In your mother's case, she possessed a blue aura. Generally, if you no longer notice any signs, you should not possess it, but the chances are not zero. You may not have needed to use it as in the case of your telekinetic powers," Edgar replied. "Is there a method to try to train telepathy?" asked Luke. "Yes, but it won't do you any good if you haven't activated it yet. Before you train it consciously, you must activate it unconsciously. Until you awaken it, there is no way to try to train it, no matter how much you know the method," replied Edgar. "What a pain. It would be nice to have a clairvoyant," Luke muttered. "You got it right in front of your eyes," said Edgar, puffing out his chest proudly. "You're a clairvoyant?" asked Luke with surprise. "Yes, and not only that, I also have a yellow aura, or well, I had when I was alive," said Edgar with a grimace. Luke looked at Edgar with envy. "It would be pretty cool to be the rare case of having both of your parents' auras." "Then look at me and tell me if I have another aura," said Luke hurriedly. "I can't, I'm a ghost. I can't use my psychic abilities anymore. Hopefully I can sense the presence of some normies, but not specific aura colors," Edgar said with a depressed air. "Then why did you say it so proudly?" thought Luke, holding back a sour comment at the sight of his ancestor's depressed state. "Let's pick up where we left off," Aura manipulation allows you to perform specific actions. In your case, moving objects would be the most basic of yellow aura. You already do it instinctively. But if you train with a method that was used by a family of hundreds of years, you may see better results, said Edgar. So, through the aura I channel my psychic abilities, asked Luke. Exactly, although I don't have my clairvoyant abilities. From what you told me, you possess a very strong innate aura, so it is more natural for you to move objects instinctively. However, not everyone possesses such an intense aura, so you have a greater than average talent, Edgar replied, and a slight arrogant smile formed on Luke's face. Still, you must not be overconfident. Over time and with proper training, an individual with a lower potential than you can strengthen and develop their aura to surpass you, so you must strive, Edgar clarified. He didn't want his great-great-grandson to become a slacker. The lesson continued for several hours. Edgar focused on teaching Luke all about the aura. After the theoretical part, they moved on to the practical part, which focused on awareness exercises, feeling the psychic energy when you move an object. Chapter 12. Infernal Training. After finishing his psychic lesson with Edgar, it was time for lunch. Natasha cooked another delicious meal. Finished with lunch, the redhead gave him an hour's rest. Suddenly, she didn't seem so heartless anymore. However, Luke had nothing to do in the apartment. He had no internet and he had already finished the Dracula book he bought earlier. Hey, I'm bored. Do you have any interesting books I can borrow? Asked Luke, looking at Natasha, who was sitting on a sofa with her legs crossed reading a book. Since it was summer, Natasha was wearing short shorts that exposed her long white legs that were very well proportioned. Her thighs were strong and she had trained calves. Luke was struggling to keep his vision fixed on Natasha's face. There was a lot to see, but he didn't want to come off like a teenager who couldn't control his hormones. The books I have won't appeal to you. Go do something else, Natasha said without looking up from her book. Gee, that nasty, thought Luke, turning and walking towards the exit of the house. He had money left over. He could buy some books or something in the stores in Jericho. Where are you going, Luke? Asked Natasha, looking up from the book for the first time. To walk around, Luke said vaguely without turning around. You can't come back here, said Natasha in a serious tone. However, Luke waved his hand dismissively without looking back. She wasn't his mother, and he had freedom. From one second to the next, Luke felt himself being pulled back with great force. Natasha had grabbed him by his shirt, grabbed his wrist and bent it. With great force, the redhead pulled Luke onto the couch he was on before. Ouch, ouch. It hurts, growled Luke as his arm was bent and he lay sprawled on the couch. You must obey what I say, Luke. I don't ask for much, said Natasha, putting more force so Luke couldn't escape. Am I going to be locked up all summer in this house? Asked Luke, trying to wriggle out of Natasha's grip. But it was useless. The redhead had monstrous strength. How could she have so much strength in those delicate arms? Although they were defined, they didn't look like much. Going alone is dangerous. I can't protect you if someone attacks you, Natasha said in a serious tone, bringing her face close to Luke's. You didn't seem to mind when I wandered the inhospitable streets of Boston alone, Luke commented. That was different. I was to act the same way with all the other children. Now the enemies of the Poe family might try to do something if they already know your whereabouts, said Natasha in a softer tone, letting go of Luke's wrist. I understand, said Luke, rubbing his wrist. In a little while we will start with the training. After that I will accompany you to the center to shop. For now you can read this book, said Natasha. Grabbing the book she dropped earlier and passing it to Luke, Luke took the book and read the title. 101 Macabre Uses for Household Utensils, from the shovel to the butter knife. Is this what she likes to read? Thought Luke, reading the title of the book that Natasha was reading earlier with great concentration. Okay, thanks. I'll read it, said Luke, and Natasha let him off the hook. He read the strange book for a while until it was time for Luke's physical training. As expected, they would do it in the house. According to Natasha, it was dangerous to go to a gym or something. They used the empty living room for training. For 2 hours, he was beaten to a pulp by Natasha. She started teaching him a martial art called Kyokushinshin. When Luke heard this strange and difficult name, he had no idea what it was all about. Kyokushinshin is a style of karate that surpasses traditional karate in violence and effectiveness. It uses attacks that are not allowed in traditional karate and is based on finishing the fight quickly and accurately. Natasha was a sadist. She beat him to a pulp, and the rest she gave him was minimal. It was summer and it was very hot. Luke ended up all sweaty and with no energy at all. Luke was tempted several times to use his powers to get back at Natasha, try to push her or something, but seeing the redhead's arrogant face that said, "Come on, use your powers if you're so weak," he decided not to use them and endure the training. We're done for the day. Go take a bath, you stink. Tomorrow we'll continue, said Natasha, who was only a little sweaty. Tomorrow? I thought the muscles were supposed to rest to recover, said Luke with his tongue hanging out. That's for normies, said Natasha with disdain. Outcasts have stronger bodies than normies, she added as she left the room. The days passed. Luke's psychic and physical training routine continued without interruption. As for the psychic training, he enjoyed it. He saw rapid progress and did not find it difficult, but the physical training was torture. Natasha didn't hold back and left him all sore. Besides, it was impossible to beat her in a duel no matter how much practice. His routine ended at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so he had a lot of free time. Since he didn't have much to do, he tried his luck and asked Natasha to hire an internet service. To his surprise, she agreed, and within 2 days they had the best internet possible. Seeing how easy it was to get internet, he decided to be more daring and asked Natasha to buy him a laptop. The next day, the latest MacBook arrived at his home. As far as Luke knew, it was worth about $2.00, and Natasha bought it for him without batting an eye. It seemed she wasn't so heartless after all, and yes, she was the Poe family housekeeper. Although she may have complied with his whims to keep him from leaving the house, he then asked her for the latest iPhone, and Natasha nodded without giving it much thought. The next day, his state-of-the-art cell phone arrived. From one day to the next, he went from being a poor orphan to a spoiled child. So he decided to put more effort into training with Natasha. If they give you kindness, you give kindness. This way he can keep asking Natasha for things. He didn't know where she got the money from, but it must have been her, since he previously looked at his parents' inheritance, and all he had was the old house. There wasn't a single dollar. As far as psychic lessons, Luke learned about focus, the other main element that interacts with the aura. It refers to the specific focal point on an individual's body through which he channels and concentrates his psychic energy to perform actions such as telekinesis in Luke's case. According to Edgar's explanation, when you use psychic abilities, you concentrate energy in the chosen focus. There is usually a natural focus, but there is flexibility. In Luke's case, to use his telekinesis powers, he uses his eyes as a focus. But another focus can be his hands, as when he performs the psychic strike. Luke, when knowing his natural focus, tried to link it with his aura. Through this, he managed to have a more effective and precise control than before by doing it consciously. From what Edgar said, in the future it will not be mandatory for him to see objects to move them, so his focus will be able to change. Some psychics can lift objects that are not in their field of vision, but they know they are there, but it requires more practice. It's time to write, Carrie, Luke thought with a greedy grin. His journey as a writer with ideas of a parallel reality would begin now that he owned a MacBook where he could write without any problems. He should just ask his great-great-grandfather about some useful memory-making skills so he could have accurate recollections of his past life. He will not tell you that he is a reincarnated person. He will just tell Eder that he has a photographic memory and wants to recall more accurately memories from many years ago, like when he was a 5-year-old boy. When in fact what he will be doing is trying to accurately recall when he read Carrie many years ago, more than 14 years. His photographic memory is not infallible. If you read a book, you can go a month or more, and you will remember the contents of the book perfectly. However, it is not the same with memories from 10 years ago or from his other life. He has no memory of when he was a baby. The faces of his parents in his memories are a blur. I hope he has a method, Luke thought, looking at the necklace and gently shaking it to get the ghost to come out. If he didn't get it, he would have to write Carrie with his current knowledge of the plot and his writing skills that are not on par with the master Stephen King. Chapter 13, Double Aura. Let's start where we left off yesterday, said Edgar, but before he could continue speaking, Luke interrupted him. Before that, I have a query, said Luke. What is it? Asked Edgar, a little curious. When I was reading books in school, I discovered that I have a photographic memory. Just reading a book once was enough for me to remember it perfectly. However, it's not the same with memories from many years ago, Luke began, not noticing that Edgar's eyes widened like saucers, which is why I was wondering if you have any method of managing to remember events from many years ago, said Luke. Did you say photographic memory? Asked Edgar, suddenly approaching Luke. Yes, photographic memory, replied Luke, backing away. The door to the room opened, and in walked Natasha, who seemed to have been listening to the conversation, although in reality she could only hear Luke talking alone. The redhead looked with surprise and dumbfounded at Luke, who was staring at her without understanding why she had entered. Was she spying on him so he wouldn't waste his time? Could be. She couldn't let Luke waste time with his new MacBook or his new cell phone. Did you say photographic memory? Asked Natasha in a calmer tone, getting on the bed and standing very close to Luke. Why is everyone getting so close? Don't violate my personal space, thought Luke with a grimace. To his left was the ghost of his great-great-grandfather. And to the right was Natasha. Yeah, what's wrong with me saying photographic memory? Asked Luke. Photographic memory means you have a blue aura, replied Natasha and Edgar excitedly. That means you inherited your father's and your mother's aura. She had a photographic memory too, said Natasha excitedly, and Edgar nodded repeatedly. What, seriously? Said Luke with a surprised look on his face. He had realized quite some time ago that he had a photographic memory. When did he become aware of this ability? I think it was when I was 10 years old. When I had to memorize some stupid chart they gave me at school, thought Luke with a strange look on his face. The board wasn't difficult at all. At most he would need 2 or 3 tries to do it, but just one would suffice. It's amazing. The cases of inheriting the 2 auras are very strange, said Natasha, taking Luke's cheeks with her delicate hands and looking at him as if he were an alien. Luke felt his heart start to beat faster. Why was this beauty so trusting? Did all P mistresses act this way? People with 2 auras were very rare, even in the Poe family that had hundreds of years of history. There were less than 10. Luke joined this exclusive group. You must train your blue aura. It will be very useful to us in our revenge against the Spellman family, Natasha said with an evil grin. She could see the day when Luke would fulfill the revenge closer than before. Yes, said Luke as Natasha walked towards the door and let him continue his training. Why is photographic memory catalogued in the blue aura? What does it have to do with telepathy? Asked Luke, looking at Edgar. The blue aura is associated with the mind, intelligence, and mental capacity. Photographic memory, like telepathy, is associated with the mind and perception, replied Edgar. I thought all psychic abilities had to do with the mind, said Luke, confused. The focuses are different. You move objects with your mind. You use your focus eyes to channel your psychic energy. In contrast, a person with a blue aura uses the focus brain, explained Edgar. Knowing that Luke possessed 2 auras, a very rare case among psychics, he began his blue aura-specific training. Although Edgar did not have a blue aura, he was able to train Luke with no problems. He was not the first blue aura individual he had trained. A month passed. Both trainings were on very good track. Natasha was still as demanding, but Luke this month noticed changes. His physical endurance had improved a lot compared to the beginning, and he had learned basic movements of the martial art taught by Natasha. What Natasha said was true. The body of an outcast was much stronger than that of a normie. He trained every day for 2 hours and did not need rest days like normal people. Also, his growth was superior to normies. Luke woke up that day at 10:30 am. He noticed that he wasn't woken up by Natasha like these days. What happened? He thought with a sleepy face as he stood up and quickly changed. It was nice to be left to sleep and not let as much light as possible into a darkened room. Arriving in the dining room, he noticed Natasha sitting drinking tea next to a tall woman with almost white, blonde hair. It was Principal Larissa. Good morning, Principal, Luke greeted politely. He liked Principal Larissa. She treated him kindly and helped him whenever she could. Good morning, Luke. I told you to just call me Larissa. The school hasn't started yet, Larissa said with a slight smile, and Luke nodded as he sat down next to Natasha. Natasha had already prepared and left Luke's breakfast ready on the table. What brings you here? Asked Luke, starting to eat. Usually Larissa visits them once a week, but it hasn't been a week yet since the last visit. 2 things. First, here's the Nevermore uniform. 7 sets with your exact measurements, said Larissa, placing on the free part of the table a full bag. That many? Asked Luke with a raised eyebrow. Yes, 1 for each day of the week, replied Natasha, since she ordered so many pairs of uniforms. Okay, thanks, said Luke without giving it much more thought. Natasha was like that. One day large quantities of clothes arrived at the house, all brand names, Nike, Adidas, etc., all with Luke's exact measurements, even sneakers, from one day to the next. He had his closet full of brand new clothes. He asked Natasha how she knew his measurements. She replied that she took them in his sleep. Luke got the creeps, and while he was sleeping like an angel, she snuck into his room and started measuring him without him noticing. He put the subject aside. He knew it was useless to argue with her. Second and more important topic. This, Larissa said with a smile, placing in front of Luke an object wrapped in wrapping paper. Luke with curiosity and surprise tore the paper. Indeed, it was what he thought. So fast? Asked Luke excitedly as he looked at the book in his hands. It was about his first book in this world, Carrie. Although he had blatantly stolen the idea, since Stephen King did not exist in this world, he decided to bring his great works to this world. On the one hand, because he is a fan, such works should be brought to light, and on the other hand, for the money, obviously. Thanks to Edgar's training with the blue aura, he managed with his photographic memory to go back to when he was reading Stephen's work. It was difficult. He needed more than 15 days of training. Then writing the book was easy. It was like copying an assignment. He was thinking of sending his manuscript to several publishers, but he thought it would be very difficult for them to accept it since it is the work of a 14-year-old teenager. So he asked Larissa for help, who readily agreed and acted as his literary agent. Larissa had many contacts and was a very capable woman. She loved literature and was a fan of Edgar Allan Poe. When she read Carrie, she was fascinated. At first, she didn't have much faith in Luke's work even though he had the last name Poe. But she was wrong and liked Carrie. However, in the end it was a tragedy of an outcast murdering over 400 normies. Larissa alone thought of Carrie as an outcast, even though she is not called such in the book. She thought Luke was inspired by the outcast and normie community in his former school life. The first to read the manuscript was Natasha, a living person. Edgar read it first, while Luke was writing it, and she also loved Carrie. What she liked most was the carnage Carrie caused, and she would have liked her to murder everyone and Carrie to have survived. Edgar read the story while Luke typed it on his MacBook. He also liked the story and was very surprised by Luke's writing skills. Not only was the idea appealing, he was amazed at the dialogue, the descriptions, and how he put the novel itself together so perfectly. Yes, Empyrean Publishing was delighted with the book. They want to publish it as soon as possible. Larissa said with a smile. The Poe family would once again have a talented writer who could be on par with Edgar Allan Poe. Luke, sipping his tea, almost choked. So fast, he said, asking the same question as before. Publishers usually take several weeks or months to get back to you and always reject you. He had underestimated Larissa's literary agent skills. Yes, they already sent me a copy of the publishing contract. It's the best offer I could get and it's very good considering it's your first book and you're 14 years old, replied Larissa, looking at Luke strangely. Many writers struggled their whole lives to get a book launched, and Luke did it with his first book in a ridiculous age. If these writers ever noticed this, they'd have a stroke or something. Larissa pulled out the contract and started explaining it to Luke. Natasha didn't say anything. She knew Larissa didn't want to take advantage of Luke. After all, she was Sophie's best friend, and she had too much money to want to take advantage. Chapter 14. Social Medias. After an hour and a half, Larissa left. In 3 days, Luke was to meet with a person who would be coming to Jericho to sign the contract. Natasha would also sign as she is his legal guardian. It looks like in days you will become a writer, the youngest in the Poe family. Your parents would be proud, said Natasha with a smile. Yeah, said Luke with a barely visible grimace. He felt no accomplishment for writing Carrie. He had stolen it. He even felt some guilt. What happened to Stephen King in this world? Maybe he was killed by outcasts or something. It's after 11 o'clock now and your psychic training begins. I was quite lenient and let you get some more sleep, Natasha commented as she looked at the time. Indulgent you? Thought Luke in annoyance. He just nodded and went to his room to continue his psychic training. 3 days passed, and Luke met with the person from the publisher to sign his contract and discuss the final details of his book. Luke had already advanced a lot of work and already had a cover that was Carrie's original. He drew a clear sketch and then a professional would improve it. The editor liked the cover and was surprised at Luke's drawing ability. Although it was not as good as his writing, Natasha, thanks to her attractiveness, a weapon she knows how to use very well, managed to increase the percentage of royalties that Luke would receive. This is the percentage of the income generated by the sales of the book. It is paid quarterly, and usually a first-time author receives 8. Thanks to Natasha, he was able to get 12. She was really reliable. An extra 4 was a great deal. Once the contract was signed, Luke received a juicy $5 cash advance. The publisher had high hopes for Carrie and they were betting big on Luke. He never had that much money in his life, although they gave it to Natasha since she was his legal guardian. But she handed it over to Luke, not caring too much. Now all that was left to do was to wait about a month for the publisher to produce and print the book. They already had a model ready. It was the one Larissa had given to Luke earlier, so it wouldn't be long before Carrie would be released. Nevermore was a month away, so his book will be published around that time. A little later, as they will have to do the promotional campaign for the book, Luke's summer continued without much more change. In Jericho, he had no friends, so he didn't get out much. Plus, he had to be careful in case he was attacked by the Spellman psychos, so he wasn't very good at going out much. Even so, there was no sign of enemies. He continued with his psychic routine being taught by Edgar. Then he had his physical training routine with Natasha, who was merciless and always ended up with his muscles sore and all sweaty. One day he had to meet with a publishing employee to talk about Carrie. They met at the Weather Vane. This was Jericho's main coffee shop and where Tyler the Unseen Hyde from Wednesday's series worked part-time. Luke, thanks to his photographic memory, was able to accurately recall the entire plot of Wednesday, so he already remembered the Hyde boy's name. However, Tyler doesn't work here yet. He is most likely Luke's age and not yet of a legal age to work part-time. Minimally, you have to be 16 years old. You want me to set up social media? Asked Luke, looking at the middle-aged man in charge of the publishing house. His name was Josh. He had a big receding hairline, square glasses, and a scruffy beard. Yes, it will be key to promoting the book. The essential thing is that you create a profile on Instagram and TikTok. The publisher's social media will promote the book and make the public go to your social media. It will be very eye-catching thanks to your last name, the successor to Poe. Horror is coming back to the family. Josh replied enthusiastically. He could already taste Carrie's success. Besides the fact that the book was very good, the person who wrote it had the last name Poe, and everyone knew this last name in the literary world. The best part was that Luke was actually related to Edgar Allan Poe. This will make the promotion and sale of the book much more successful. Fine, said Luke without much enthusiasm. He didn't use social media and didn't like it either. After you create them, upload some selfies smiling. I'm sure you'll attract a female audience your age. Josh said with a smile. Selfies smiling, thought Luke, putting on a not at all happy expression. That would be normie, and he didn't like the idea at all. Natasha, seeing Luke's expression, held back her laughter. Yeah, you should take a couple of pictures of yourself. I'm sure you'll have lots of fans, Natasha said, teasing Luke. I'm a writer, not an idol, Luke thought with a frown. He wasn't even a writer though, not like that. If you always have a frown on your face, you'll get old faster. Smile a little. It will be an important part of increasing book sales. With this, you'll get a fan base and loyal readers who will start following you. It won't be your only book, will it? Asked Josh. Josh's publisher wanted to continue working with Luke. His writing career was just beginning, and they had great faith that he would grow and get better and better. I'll do it, Luke said. If taking a couple of selfies would increase the money he would make in the future, he didn't mind leaving his pride behind and creating social media like a normie. With this meeting over, Luke's book promotion began. He created his social media and uploaded some pictures of himself. Though he didn't smile, he was a horror writer. His great-great-grandfather was never seen smiling in his photos, and he planned to replicate that. Thanks to the publisher's promotion, he got a lot of followers. The promotion began before launching the book, which was just a few days away from having all the printed copies needed for its release. To generate expectation, during the promotional period before the book's release, Luke got 10,000 followers on Instagram. He never thought the day would come when he would have so many followers. His photos had thousands of likes and many comments. How does it feel to be a little famous? Asked Natasha as she ate next to Luke. It's no big deal either. Some people have millions of followers, replied Luke. He was just doing it so his book would sell more. He didn't care about fame. Isn't it dangerous? I mean, now my enemies will be able to see that I have social media, Luke asked, looking at Natasha. He was surprised that she had agreed to her becoming some sort of public figure. It's the same thing. As long as you don't be an idiot and post your location in statuses or pictures, nothing happens. Just upload smiling selfies, Natasha replied. I don't upload smiley selfies, growled Luke. Anyway, I'm surprised those Spellman bastards haven't made a move by now. They should have been aware by now since you signed up for Nevermore many days ago, Natasha said with a frown. Maybe the demons ate them, said Luke with a slight smile. I hope not. I want to kill them with my bare hands, Natasha said angrily and with great murderous intent. Luke looked at her strangely. Why were his maid and great-great-grandfather such psychopaths? Greendale, among tree-covered hills and bordered by a meandering river, was Greendale, a small town in the United States with less than 10,000 inhabitants. In a more secluded part of town stood a funeral home with a dark stone facade and tarnished glass windows, surrounded by tall trees with a gloomy appearance which causes there to always be a permanent fog in the place. Near the funeral home is a cemetery with moss-covered tombstones. Destroyed statues of angels with suffering faces observe the place with their cold and empty eyes. Next to the funeral home stands a mansion, with peaked roofs and turrets soaring skyward. The mansion stands out as a monument of decadent opulence and hidden darkness. The grayish stone of the mansion is covered in twisted ivy, which snakes along the walls like bony fingers trying to grasp the unsuspecting. Inside the mansion, in one of the numerous rooms, a conversation was taking place. The room was large and ostentatious. A plush armchair sat near a fireplace that was burning even though it was summer. A silhouette watched the fire burn. Behind him stood a teenage girl. Are you traveling to Jericho tomorrow? The silhouette asked. Her tone of voice was thick and husky. Yes, I have everything ready, replied the girl respectfully. She could not observe the man's face as the back of the armchair covered it. You have a mission. You will have the great honor of ending our family's grudge for once, said the man with mixed emotions. I will do it. I don't think it will be too hard. That boy lived all his life surrounded by normies. It'll be a piece of cake, said the girl with a carefree smile. And without feeling much pressure, don't be overconfident. Don't underestimate the Poe. Even if it's the last one on this earth, you must finish it as soon as possible. You will have a deadline of 1 year, said the man. A year? I'll have to be in that Nevermore Academy for a whole year? The girl asked, whining. You don't have a choice. If you murder one person and then leave the school, you will be a suspect, replied the man in a forceful tone. I won't let them catch me, said the girl. It's already decided. You'll be there for the whole year, said the man without giving any more room for discussion. Fine, growled the girl under her breath. You can go now, said the man, and the girl left grumbling under her breath. Kids these days, thought the man, shaking his head as he took a sip from a glass of thick reddish-colored liquid. Chapter 15. Start of classes. Monday arrived, which meant the start of school. Luke woke up earlier than usual. He sat up in his bed and looked at the bag he had packed the night before. Summer went by so fast, Luke thought with a grimace and sleepy face. He didn't want to go to school. Any Otaku soul who transmigrated would be happy to attend Nevermore, but he was not. He already hated school. Getting up early, attending classes you don't like, mountains of homework, and a lot of other annoying things. That is a normal school. Nevermore was worse than a regular school because it was a boarding school. You didn't go home until vacation. You had to live there for months. You had to share a room with a person you wouldn't get along with. Although this didn't bother Luke very much. After all, he lived in an orphanage with dozens of annoying kids. You don't look too happy about starting school, Edgar said, coming out of the collar. Of course not. Who the hell likes school? Asked Luke, standing up and starting to put on his Nevermore uniform. To your mother in the early days, she always seemed so enthusiastic, Edgar replied, and Luke grimaced. He barely had any memory of his mother in this world. In his previous life, his parents were barely home. They gave him money to buy whatever he wanted. And they were always working, so he never had much of a family bond. However, his mother in this life gave her life to protect him. If it wasn't for her and his father, he would have died. So he felt empathy for her and hatred for those guilty of her murder. He left his room and sat down at the table. Breakfast was already ready. Natasha sat sipping coffee while checking her cell phone. I won't have these delicious breakfasts anymore, Luke thought regretfully. He had to admit that Natasha was an expert cook. Plus, she cooks his favorite dishes for him. Why that face? Asked Natasha, looking at Luke. The strange thing was that her mouth didn't move, her lips were still closed. Luke looked up from his delicious breakfast and looked at Natasha. He had clearly heard what Natasha asked, even though Natasha didn't speak. This was the telepathy he had developed over the last while. He never thought he could communicate through his mind with another person. All he had to do was to create a mental link with the person who did not have telepathy so that this person could talk to him whenever this person wanted. The link is limited by the telepathic abilities of the caster. Currently, Luke can only converse telepathically with a person who is within 3 of him. This is more than enough distance for a person in the same room and is the result of his training. Both Edgar and Natasha could not believe how fast he was progressing. Another thing to keep in mind is that the link has a certain lifespan. If it is not renewed, the telepath must create another link to continue connected and be able to converse through the mind. Luke's current time was 20 days. After that, he must see Natasha and recreate a mind link so they can continue to converse telepathically. According to Edgar, Luke's mother could create a link with a lifetime of a couple of years and a distance of 500. The Blue Aura's abilities were not only limited to mental communication, there was also photographic memory and many more useful and powerful abilities. Do I have to go to Nevermore? If we are separated, it will be more dangerous, Luke said without moving his lips. Since he mastered this skill, they talked this way with Natasha to practice. You must go. By now they must be aware that you are in Jericho. If you don't get into Nevermore and stay here, they won't stay put. It will be dangerous. Your father was safe in his time at Nevermore, Natasha replied as she ate. Thanks to telepathy, she could eat and converse at the same time. On the other hand, it is important that you get the link to a distance of 15 km. As for time, I can make regular visits with Larissa's help to replenish it, said Natasha. Yes, said Luke without so much encouragement. He knew he had no choice but to attend school. As for the 15 km, they needed it because that was the distance from Jericho and Nevermore Academy. If Luke could get their link that distance, they could communicate with Natasha while he was at Nevermore. This way they can converse at any time and instantly if something dangerous happens. Much more effective than a cell phone. In such a short time of training, you have already achieved a distance of 3 kilometers in a lifespan of 20 days. You have a great talent, Natasha said with sincerity and surprise. Natasha considered Sophie as her older sister Luke's mother. Although they did not have a blood bond, so she knew telepathic abilities very well. Sophie was a very talented telepath and was not as talented as Luke was at her age. Besides, Luke not only trained his blue aura, he also possessed a yellow aura and spent time training for that aura. So, he dedicated less time compared to a person who can dedicate himself to training the only aura he possesses. Another thing to note is that Luke started training his telepathic abilities at an advanced age, as he lived for 13 years in a normie orphanage. Sophie, on the other hand, trained her blue aura from an earlier age. I know, Luke said smugly. His talent in the yellow aura was greater, although this was because he awakened it much earlier and used it more regularly. With that attitude you won't get friends, said Natasha. She had noticed that Luke was odd, though to think this of an outcast was odd in itself, and even more so if he was a member of the Poe family. However, Luke was 14 and odd even by teenage outcast standards. I don't need them, Luke said with a grimace and continued to eat his breakfast in silence. The only friend he had ever had in this world betrayed him, and because of him, he was expelled from normie school. After breakfast, Natasha called for a cab. They loaded up their luggage and headed for Nevermore Academy. The cab driver seemed a bit scared to take them to Nevermore Academy. It seemed that there was still prejudice from normies towards the outcasts, or rather weirdos of society. With a good payment everything was arranged, and he decided to accept the trip. The ride was about 15 minutes. Again he could see the gothic and imposing architecture of the academy, only this time there was a large number of people, and like the first time it was empty. The door was open and the students were herding in with their parents or friends. Remember to train. I'll investigate those Spellman bastards, Natasha said through the mental link. Luke nodded as he got out of the cab with his luggage. After saying goodbye briefly, Natasha returned to Jericho with the same cab. Luke looked at the sea of people and students entering the academy with a slight frown on his hands. He held his luggage. Unlike the boys and girls entering with their parents, he was alone, though this was not what bothered him. It sure is moving. Come on, walk. Maybe you'll get a girlfriend or something, Edgar commented in a mocking tone. Luke grunted and started walking toward the grand entrance to Nevermore Academy. He still could not converse telepathically with Edgar. Since he was a ghost, the degree of difficulty was higher, since they function differently than a human or something like that, Edgar explained to him. He could observe a large number of students. Unlike him, most of them had expectant faces, smiling and waiting to start a new stage in their lives. Why do they all look so normie? Luke thought, walking around and observing the students. Even physically there wasn't much difference from the normies, only the faceless outcasts were different. They have no features on their faces. That is to say, they do not possess mouths, noses and eyes. However, on their faces you can discern the shape where the eyes, mouth and nose should be. They do not have a flat face. What the hell is their advantage? I'd rather be a normie, Luke thought in disgust. Looking at a group of 3 faceless students, maybe they have some secret ability or something. As he brazenly watched the faceless ones who were oblivious, Luke heard a voice near him. Are you Luke Poe? Asked the tone of voice that belonged to a girl. Yes, I can't be wrong. I follow you on Instagram, added the girl in a loud and enthusiastic tone. Luke turned his head and could see a girl with blonde hair and blue eyes. Her hair has blue highlights and pink highlights on the ends. She has light freckles and different colored fingernails. She is wearing the traditional Nevermore uniform and is from the same year as Luke. Enid, thought Luke with surprise. He never thought he would meet one of Wednesday's main characters so quickly. More surprising was that he didn't have to do anything. Enid was looking at Luke with a big smile and a cheerful aura that seemed to envelop her in a shield of light, completely different from Luke's aura and unfriendly face. Yeah, it's me, Luke replied after a few seconds. Enid was cuter than the memories he had. And he had a photographic memory. I knew it. Wait a minute, said Enid as she started digging through her backpack. After a few seconds she pulled out a book that Luke recognized very well. Carrie. She already has Carrie, thought Luke in surprise. The publisher had gone to great lengths and brought Carrie forward for publication. Last week it was published. Luke had to attend Jericho's largest bookstore to promote the book and sign autographs, even though he wasn't really looking forward to this. In just 1 week since Carrie was published, Luke's popularity on social networks increased a lot, reaching 25,000 followers on Instagram. Can I get an autograph? I'm one of your first fans. I couldn't attend the first book signing because I live in San Francisco, said Enid, justifying herself. My fan, thought Luke with a strange look on his face. If he thought about people who liked the book, Carrie, he wouldn't think Enid was one of them. Her happy aura didn't fit Stephen King's horror literature or his horror literature. Sure, Luke replied, taking the book and pen Enid gave him. The shame he felt for signing a book he plagiarized was getting further and further away. The more books he signed, the less shame he felt. Sorry, Stephen. If you want revenge, I'm ready to face your avenging ghost, thought Luke, finishing signing and handing the book back to Enid. Thank you, said Enid, looking at the signature with a big smile and sparkling eyes. You're welcome, replied Luke, looking around. He noticed that many people were pointing and whispering to each other as they watched him. This is not good, Luke thought as he started to flee the place. He didn't like being the center of attention. His escape mission failed. A girl and a boy stopped his pace and asked him the same question as Enid. Then they pulled out 2 copies of Carrie and he had to sign them. He wanted to escape again, but more and more people came out asking him for autographs and even photos. Luke began to have a pale complexion. He didn't like being surrounded and enclosed by people he didn't know. It was a bad idea to publish Carrie in an outcast school when your last name is Poe, one of the best-known surnames in the world of outcasts, if not the best-known and most popular. Too close, he thought Luke nervously, watching 3 faceless students approach him. Behind him a gaggle of students who appeared to be vampires by their pale complexion and dark glasses. There was no room to escape. He was surrounded on all sides, and they all already had Carrie's book in their hands. How the hell did they buy it so fast? At one point he felt someone grab him by the wrist and he started to run, so he had no choice but to follow the person. Chapter 16, Start of Classes A. As he ran, he dodged students while being guided by the person who saved him. They turned several corners and came to an almost empty place. Sit down, said the person who helped Luke escape. Luke, who had cold sweat on his face, sat down on the bench. He felt his pulse racing. He was not good with crowds around him. In his previous life, he was an otaku who barely left the house. Damn, what a pathetic weakness, Luke thought with a frown. After a few seconds, he regained his composure and looked up. The person helping him escape was Enid, who was looking at him worriedly. Are you okay? Asked Enid, approaching Luke. Yeah, replied Luke dryly and lightly, pushing Enid away from him. Really, your face is pale. We should go to the infirmary, said Enid worriedly. No, I'm fine, although I'd be better off if it weren't for you screaming and getting everyone's attention, Luke said with a grimace. If it wasn't for Enid, it would have gone unnoticed. I'm sorry, said Enid apologetically, looking down at the floor. Luke couldn't believe it. A normal person would have sent him to hell instead of apologizing. Now he felt a little guilty, something that rarely happened to him. Here, Enid said, pulling a handkerchief out of one of her pockets. Luke took the handkerchief while looking at Enid as if she were an alien. He could tell Enid's kind attitude was real. It wasn't fake like most people. Luke began to wipe his sweat with the handkerchief. Enid sat down next to him as she looked at him out of the corner of her eye. Thank you, Luke said after a few seconds and with great difficulty. It's just a handkerchief, said Enid. Not for that, for helping me out of there, clarified Luke. A bright expression returned to Enid's face. You're welcome, although you're right. If I hadn't made such a fuss, you wouldn't have been in that situation, Enid said, returning to her cheerful and radiant mood. Well, with the handkerchief or even, I'll get it back to you later, said Luke as the handkerchief was with his sweat on it. Don't bother, I'll clean it up, said Enid, holding out her hand for Luke to return the handkerchief. No, it's sweaty and you gave it to me clean. I'll clean it later and then give it back to you, said Luke without giving her the handkerchief. No, I'll clean it. Give it back to me, said Enid as she began to struggle with Luke to take the handkerchief from him. It would be rude to give it back to you in sweat, said Luke, trying to force himself so Enid wouldn't beat him. That's fine, I don't mind the sweat. I'll wipe it off, said Enid stubbornly as the struggle continued. Enid won after a few seconds of struggling. Her strength was monstrous. Luke couldn't compete with her, so he ended up losing the handkerchief from her hands. Her strength is no joke, thought Luke in surprise as Enid put the handkerchief away with a smile. As if nothing had happened. How do you have so much strength? Asked Luke, even though he already knew the answer. I'm a werewolf. Well, rather a female wolf, Enid said, putting a finger to her chin as the ending was confusing. She already has superior strength without needing to transform, thought Luke. It wasn't strange for a werewolf or werewoman to have a superior body in terms of physical strength. What's your name? Asked Luke, even though he knew it. So far he didn't ask her, and it would be weird if he suddenly knew her name. How clueless of me not to introduce myself, said Enid, holding a hand to her head. I'm Enid Sinclair. I'm starting 9th grade this year. Nice to meet you, added Enid with a big smile and extending her hand. So she's my age, thought Luke, which means Wednesday is also the same age as him, which leads to the canon starting in 2.5 years. Luke Poe, also a 9th grader, said Luke, accepting Enid's handshake. It won't be long until the entrance ceremony, Luke thought, looking at the time on his cell phone. We should get going. The ceremony will be in the central courtyard, commented Enid. Looking at the time on Luke's cell phone, who nodded slightly and got up from his seat. Luke didn't know his way around Nevermore. Enid, on the other hand, seemed to know the school better than he did, so it would serve to have her as a guide. Although it was a short walk, Enid was like a parrot. She kept talking and asking Luke questions. It was the first time he had met someone so cheerful and enthusiastic. It was exhausting. She talked to him a lot about Carrie, giving him her opinion and asking him about a lot of questions she had. They arrived at the central courtyard, which had a lot of grass in the open area and a large tree. It was surrounded by the school buildings. There was a large arrangement of folding chairs for the students to sit on. Most of the seats were taken. Luke and Enid sat in the back rows next to each other. Luckily, no one recognized them anymore. On the stage they had set up for this occasion came Principal Larissa, who as always was appropriately and professionally dressed. Welcome to Nevermore Academy. To the new students. Welcome back to the students who passed the year, began Larissa with her speech. 2 weeks had passed since Luke started classes at Nevermore Academy. Things had calmed down compared to the beginning, especially the attention he was getting. He was famous and popular for 2 reasons. On the one hand, because of Carrie, who was a smash hit, or so his publisher said. On the other hand, because of his last name, Poe, a very famous surname at Nevermore Academy. His great-great-grandfather Edgar Allan Poe was an alumnus of Nevermore Academy. He has a statue, and Nevermore's most important annual competition is named after him, the Poe Cup. His great-great-grandfather is arguably the most famous alumnus in the Academy's history. So, having the Poe surname gave you a lot of notoriety and popularity that Luke hates. The first few days were very annoying for Luke. Many people approached him because of his last name Poe and his success with Carrie, but thanks to his face a few friends and that he responded sarcastically, mockingly or uninterested. His popularity was over, a great record. He drove away all the annoying flies in 2 weeks. He resumed his solitary and quiet life. The only person who kept bothering him was Enid. That girl wouldn't give up. She didn't give up on Wednesday. Who was ruder and had less patience than Luke, so it wasn't weird at all. Another person he kept chatting with was Xavier Thorpe, one of the main characters in the series. He is a psychic just like Luke, and his father is a very famous psychic. He is related to Xavier because they share the same bedroom. Nevermore contains 4 bedrooms. Luke is in the Ravenloft Hall, which has several rooms and a common room. With Xavier he shares a room. His room is spacious. The walls are covered with dark tapestries, 2 closets, 2 bedside tables, and 2 canopy beds covered with black silk sheets and bedspreads embroidered with raven motifs. A tall window lets in a dim light which filters through heavy black velvet curtains. Each has a carved wooden desk in the corner of the room, where Luke props up his MacBook, books, and so on. Unlike Luke, who is antisocial and apathetic, Xavier is popular with his classmates, albeit in a different way than the standard normie. For Luke, Xavier seems like an edgy artist. The subjects at Nevermore were varied. There were subjects for every type of outcast, such as werewolf reproduction focuses on werewolf biology and anatomy, as well as transformation control and full moon management. Gorgon anatomy, study of the anatomy and special abilities of gorgons, including managing their ability to turn others to stone with their gaze. Blood and nightlife studies. This subject focuses on vampire biology, vampire history and culture, as well as mastering vampire abilities and how they will develop. Psychic power subject focused on the study and understanding of students' psychic abilities and development. These subjects were divided into 2 classes. The first class was the theory class, which all students were required to attend. Luke was to attend classes on werewolf reproduction, Gorgon anatomy, etc. It didn't matter that he was not that type of outcast. This was to learn about the types of outcasts, their history, characteristics, culture, behaviors, etc. Once the theory was finished, there was the practical part, which was specific. In werewolf reproduction you could only attend if you are a werewolf. In the case of Luke, not, since it makes no sense to practice when he can't transform. In the subject psychic powers, he must attend both theoretical and practical subjects. In addition to these subjects, he had 3 more: marginal history, fencing, and botanical sciences, which were universal no matter what type of outcast you were. Luke couldn't believe that he had to compulsorily attend fencing, but he had no choice but to do so. Now I have botany class, thought Luke, coming out of the outcast history class. Botanical science classes were being held in the Nevermore greenhouse. Walking towards the greenhouse he noticed someone tapping his shoulder. He turned and saw Enid, who as usual had a smile and an aura of joy around her. "Hi Luke, are we going to the greenhouse together?" asked Enid with a smile and looking expectantly at Luke. "Yes," replied Luke dryly and started walking. Enid smiled and started walking beside him. Their ways of walking were different. Luke walked lazily and with a tired expression. Enid, on the other hand, seemed to be prancing around and had a lot of energy. Luke didn't understand why Enid kept talking to him. His wonderful personality had already alienated several girls who tried to talk to him in the first few days, but Enid didn't seem to mind and kept talking to him. Luke's responses are brief, reluctant, and unenthusiastic. He never starts a conversation and will never seek you out. Who would want to be friends with a guy like that? Perhaps Enid was just as stubborn as Xavier and Tyler were with Wednesday. Luke recalls that. In the series, Wednesday was apathetic and uninterested in Xavier and Tyler, who seemed like simps through and through. Yet both boys kept trying to get closer to Wednesday even though she showed no interest in them. It could also be that Enid wants to be friends with her because she's friends with everyone. Something Luke would consider fake and hypocritical, but with Enid, he knows it's not that way, and that's her true nature. Whatever it is, Luke doesn't care. It's only a matter of time before Enid stops trying to relate to him like everyone else. Chapter 17. A small sample. They arrived at the conservatory. It is a large room with a lot of plants. There are desks in the center for the students to sit and study. In front of them is a blackboard and the desk of the teacher who was already waiting for them. The teacher's name was Marilyn Thornhill, and Luke knew her very well. She was the antagonist in the Wednesday series and a normie. Her real name was Laurel Gates. She faked her death to change her identity and complete Crackstone's mission, which was to eliminate the outcasts. Marilyn has fair skin, long wavy brown hair and brown eyes. She wears a gray-colored sweater and cat-eye glasses. Eliminate the outcasts, what an idiot, Luke thought disaffectedly as he sat in a chair and looked at the teacher, who had a kind, smiling face. Luke thought both Marilyn and Crackstone were two idiots chasing an impossible dream. Eliminating all the outcasts was an impossible mission, no matter how much Crackstone had made a deal with demons and gotten powers. In the series, Crackstone loses to a 16-year-old outcast. If he were to face adult outcasts with developed powers, he would be easily defeated. At best, he could kill Nevermore students who did not fully develop their powers. That is, as long as the power he showed in the series holds up. There are even outcasts who made deals with demons, so they should be stronger than average and will be able to defeat Crackstone with a whimper. Luke wasn't planning to take on Professor Normie for the time being. Until Wednesday comes to Nevermore, the Normie will not use Hyde to assassinate, so nothing will happen. The teacher was a Normie. She had no supernatural powers. It would be very easy for Luke to kill her. The problematic thing is to cover up the murder. For this reason, Luke is too lazy to act for the moment. "Good morning, everyone," greeted Marilyn with a smile and enthusiasm. "Before we move on to a more advanced topic, let's review the homework I left for you last class," added Marilyn as she opened the textbook on her desk. Let's see, Luke. Can you answer question 1? Asked the teacher, looking at Luke. Luke hadn't pulled out the book or his notebook. He had his hands in his pockets and was rocking back and forth in his chair with a nonchalant attitude. "I'm sorry, teacher, I forgot," Luke said as he yawned and continued rocking like it was nothing. Enid next to him and everyone else looked at him, unable to believe how fake his apology sounded. He clearly wasn't sorry at all and looked like he didn't give a shit about the class. "Oh," said Marilyn with a slight twitch that no one noticed. "It's okay. We all can forget homework once in a while," she added with a smile again. "Puch hypocrite," thought Luke, amused. He knew Marilyn hated outcasts to death, but because of the personality she showed at Nevermore, she couldn't show anger towards him. She must be seething with rage, thought Luke, trying to contain his laughter. "That's true. Next time I'll try to remember if possible," Luke said with a slight smirk. "If it's possible," thought Enid and all the students, unable to believe how hard-faced Luke was. "Let's see, Bianca. Can you answer question 1? Said the teacher, moving on to another student. If she kept listening to Luke, she was afraid her facade would crumble. "Maybe I'll become the first outcast to be eliminated on their list," Luke thought curiously. "It could be that they'll send him a killer Hyde. He doesn't care, it will be a good fight. He doesn't know if the teacher has control of Hyde yet." Bianca began to read from her notebook where she had completed her homework for the day. Bianca was a mermaid and one of Nevermore's most popular students of her year. She is taller than average for her gender and has dark skin and greenish-blue eyes. She has dark hair and a shaved head. Luke took out his book, opened it, and put it on top of his head to block his view so he could sleep comfortably. As expected, class ended. And teacher Normie didn't punish him and let him sleep peacefully. Enid was in charge of waking him up. He put his book in his backpack and quickly left the greenhouse. He felt like peeing. Enid, who was about to say something to him, stood still as Luke hurriedly left the place. He didn't even thank her for what she woke up from. "Why do you keep trying to talk to him?" asked a friend of Enid's, approaching her. "He's rude, arrogant, stuck up, and I can think of many more negative adjectives," she added with a frown. She also tried to make conversation with Luke and befriend him, but he treated her like she was an annoying fly the whole time, so she gave up. "That makes it cooler," said a brown-haired girl joining the conversation. Her friend looked at her funny, though she was right. "Having the last name Poe went to his head," said a short boy with a mug hairdo approaching the group of girls. The two girls looked at the boy with some disgust. It wasn't the first time he had butted into their conversations as if they were friends. Maybe Luke felt the same way, so their anger towards him dropped incredibly low. "He lived in a normie orphanage and thinks he's the big deal," the boy said to add fuel to the fire. Unlike the girls, who might see Luke's attitude as a cool and bad boy, most of the guys loathed Luke. "Don't be rude. He published a successful book that you could never write, and that being in an orphanage," said Enid, defending Luke and scowling at the boy. It was rare to see Enid scowling and scolding a person. Enid's two friends nodded in agreement. Luke, if he had heard what Enid said, would have wanted to disappear off the earth. He didn't even create that book. It was absolute plagiarism. He would have rather flaunted his powers or his great last name than that. "Let's go," Enid said angrily, turning around and leaving the room. Her friends followed her and left the boy alone, frozen in place. What did he do wrong? They were criticizing Luke. He just joined them and was reprimanded. In the psychic powers class, there were about 40 students, but only 10 of them were psychics. The others were there to study the theoretical part. That day the others learned about the auras that each psychic can possess. So far they had only studied a little of the history of psychics, so they had had no practical classes. Before the theoretical part ended and the class slowed down, the teacher wanted to do a demonstration so that the non-psychic students could observe the auras of the psychic students. It was no secret to demonstrate the type of aura you possessed. After all, the teacher must help you so that you can train that aura. The first student to come forward was Rowan Laszlo. He has brown eyes and short brown hair that he wears with a side parting. He wears brown and gold glasses. "I'm a psychic with a yellow aura," said Rowan, nervous about being watched by everyone. "Try to move these books. Each one weighs about 5 ick," said the professor, pulling several books off a shelf and placing them on the desk. The books had over 1,000 pages, a particularly thick and sturdy binding, and a leather-reinforced hardcover. Luke was the first time he had seen such heavy books. Rowan nodded and with the help of his hand began to try to move the books. 8 of the 10 books lifted and floated up to his head. He held them for several minutes until he could no longer, and they fell, making a thud on the desk. 40 kilos, a great sum," praised the professor with a smile and clapping his hands. The whole room joined in and applauded. Luke clapped lazily. He wasn't surprised. His weight limit was currently 100 ick. In a state of rage, he managed to move a 2-ton truck for a moment. Thanks to that episode, his maximum weight increased. Before that incident, he could move about 100 ink in total. After moving the truck, he increased to 150. During training with his great-great-grandfather, he was able to increase another 30 to 108 ick. "Luke, your turn. Since we're with books, we might as well take advantage," said the teacher, looking at Luke, and all the attention of the class was on him. Everyone wanted to know what Luke's abilities were. The last descendant of the century-old Poe family, many kids looked at Luke with smirks. They had all heard that he lived in an orphanage. Hopefully he could move a book or two. Luke Leslie got up and walked with his hands in his pockets to the desk. They all knew he possessed a yellow aura. As the professor had asked them earlier, he didn't say he possessed a blue aura, as it was better to keep a secret or two to himself. 50 in total, Luke thought to Stephanie, looking at the books. Moving the shit garbage cans was more challenging than this. Without taking his hands out of his pockets, the 10 books began to float in a matter of seconds. He just needed to look at them. He didn't need to help himself with too focus like Rowan did. The professor and everyone else watched with wide eyes. The books began to circle Luke, who continued with a nonchalant look on his face. Luke smiled internally. He taught a lesson to the idiots who spoke ill of him behind his back. He had heard some disparaging remarks about him. Now they knew a little of his power. Luke made the books fly neatly back to their former places on the shelf. The presentation was over. "An excellent control," commented the professor, recovering from the shock. With this simple demonstration, he knew that Luke's weight limit was well over 50. Luke nodded slightly and returned to a seat as he was watched by the surprised faces of his classmates. "A 14-year-old at the intermediate level," thought the teacher, looking at Luke and moving on to the next student. Chapter 18, Aura Sky Blue. The next psychic to get up was Xavier. In his arms he carried a notebook and a black pencil. Bianca looked at him with a smile and rested her chin on her hands. "As you know, my aura is sky blue," said Xavier, leaning his notebook on the desk and opening it. "Sky blue aura," thought Luke with narrowed eyes. In the initial explanation Edgar gave him about auras, he said nothing about the sky blue aura. Later he explained to him the existence of this type of aura, which would be the ninth. The sky blue aura was rare among psychics, so it was generally not counted among the main auras. Not because it was weaker, but because of its rarity. Out of every 10 psychics, only one would possess a sky blue aura, that is its rarity. However, it wasn't as rare as possessing a double aura. The sky blue aura was associated with artistic expression and creativity. Psychics with this aura channel their energy into their works of art, be it music, paintings, drawings, writing, etc. Luke remembers that Xavier could make his art come to life. Without wasting any more time, Xavier drew a spider in his notebook. Within seconds the spider came to life and emerged from the paper in 3D form. Everyone was amazed at this. The spider was moving, it had life, although it looked very fragile. Amazing, praised the professor, and the whole room began to applaud enthusiastically. Thank you, said Xavier with a slight smile and returned to his seat. He doesn't look very strong, but in the future he draws the hide's claw that came to life and attack him, thought Luke, respecting Xavier more. He knows that Xavier, just like him, is a person who will possess a dual aura. Also, he possesses a strange sky blue aura. Thanks to his photographic memory, he remembered that Xavier had precognitive dreams. That is a violet aura. Everyone knew that Xavier's father was a famous psychic, Vincent Thorpe. The Thorpe family was also a famous outcast family like the Poes. Although they were not nearly extinct, it is known that Xavier's father possesses psychic visions that go into the violet aura, so Xavier got both his father's aura and his mother's aura. The latter must possess a sky blue aura. Although Xavier's sky blue aura ability is not very strong, in the future he could become very proficient in varied situations including combat. The psychic students kept passing by. Their abilities were no big deal. They were barely developed, much different than Luke's. Xavier and Rowan were the best, not counting Luke. There was one girl who possessed a green aura, but she could barely heal a useless, not very deep cut at the moment. They're no big deal, Luke thought. Before, when he lived in the orphanage, he didn't have a standard of his powers. He didn't know if they were strong, weak, or average, but now he knew. He was above average for his age and by a large margin. Rowan could move 4-ic, and he could move 108-ic, a huge difference. It could be due to his soul being reborn and more powerful or whatever. At last, Sabrina Jones called the teacher, and a girl stood up and began to walk toward the center desk. The girl was of average height with a small physique. She had short wavy blonde hair, fair skin, bright green eyes, and a delicate figure. She had a confident smile and walked confidently to the desk. Sabrina, like Bianca, was one of Luke's most popular girls of the year. Her aura was a cross between Bianca and Enid. Kind to everyone and proud, Luke straightened up from his seat and looked at Sabrina more seriously. Earlier the girl had said she possessed an orange aura, meaning elemental manipulation. One of the most useful auras for combat is next to yellow. He was curious about what element Sabrina would control and on what scale. Though he wasn't expecting much seeing everyone else. You may begin. Be careful, said the teacher, as he didn't know what element Sabrina would use. Sabrina nodded vaguely and opened her hand. A spark of orange energy began to form in the palm of her hand. Glowing with a hot glow, the energy condensed within seconds, taking the form of a dancing, sparkling sphere of fire in Sabrina's hand. The fireball was the size of a soccer. Everyone gawked at Sabrina's demonstration as she looked at everyone with a confident smile. The temperature in the room had risen several degrees because of the fireball. Amazing, pyrokinesis, praised the professor with awe and sweat on his forehead. Pyrokinesis is the power to generate, control, and manipulate fire. Luke looked at the fireball more seriously than before. Was there such a talented student in the Nevermore series? With this level of skill, she could have taken on Crackstone when he came back from the dead, or Hyde. There are several psychics who didn't make it out on Wednesday and could have done something against the old man that one. Luke thought. Either that or I can't trust 100 of the series, thought Luke. With perfect control, the fireball in Sabrina's hand disappeared and the temperature began to drop. The room erupted in applause, and Sabrina returned to her seat with a condescending smile. On the way she glanced at Luke, but he was deep in thought. Another student at an intermediate level. There are 2 monsters in this class, thought the professor in amazement. After the psychic powers class, Luke went to the room where the fencing class was being held. In the locker room he changed clothes. In fencing they used a mask that protects the head and face from possible blows. It is made of a sturdy metal mesh that allows good vision and ventilation in addition to protection. A padded jacket that covers the student's torso and arms to absorb impacts and protect against thrusts and cuts during combat. Gloves and pants are made of a resistant material. Gather around, everyone. We have already finished learning the basic positions and moves. Today we will have a practice fight. Take your swords and choose a partner," said Professor Vlad, an elegant man with short brown hair and light eyes. The fencing swords they use for practice are designed to be lighter and more flexible, with a blunt tip and a blade that has no edge. Luke took the sword and watched as everyone chose their partners and stood at attention awaiting the professor's command. A grimace formed on his face at the sight. He hated activities in pairs. He would be left without a partner, and the professor would look at him with pity while the others made fun of how lonely he was. Previously he never went through this situation as he had Tom. But so far he didn't make a single friend at Nevermore. "Luke, do you want to practice with me?" asked Enid, approaching with a smile and dressed in her white fencing outfit. "Fine," replied Luke, more relieved as he wouldn't be the center of attention for being a loner with no friends. The latter didn't bother him. He was annoyed at being the center of attention. Despite Luke's disinterested and rude attitude, Enid kept trying to make conversation with him. You could say that out of all the students, Luke treated Enid better than the others. Only because he knew her personality was real since he watched the Wednesday series. Otherwise, he would think Enid is a hypocrite who wants to be friends with everyone. Enid noticed Luke's subtle changes. His answers were getting better and better, and he didn't seem as disinterested as before. Even if only a little, so she was happy about her advancement. Why was she doing it? Because she was interested in Luke, not because of his famous last name and the fame he had for his successful book. She couldn't deny that she was a fan since she liked Carrie so much. But that wasn't what mattered to her. What appealed to her most about Luke was his authenticity. He was a real person, not fake, neither in real life nor on social media. In the photos he uploaded, he always had the same unfriendly face. He doesn't show a mask like most people. Besides, she knew Luke was kind, unlike what others think. He thanked her when she saved him and even wanted to wipe her handkerchief. She felt that Luke, like her, was authentic, both with very different personalities, but authentic. "I must close the gap on him today." Enid thought decisively and put on her helmet. "Everyone in position, use the moves we learned." "Ready, begin," exclaimed Professor Vlad. Luke was on guard, an important position they learned these days. In this position at any time he could attack, defend, or move. When the professor gave the signal, he began to march toward Enid at a moderate pace. Enid did not stand still and also began to advance with her eyes on Luke and her senses at maximum. When they were at a close distance, Luke was the first to attack. He stretched out his front leg, lunging forward, and at the same time his back leg pushed forward as well. At that instant he stretched out his sword arm and reached a maximum extension point in the air. Enid was surprised by Luke's perfect attack, which, although they were basic movements he had executed to perfection, she was not the only one surprised. Professor Vlad watched closely as Luke's attack was executed perfectly. To Luke's surprise, Enid at the last moment dodged his lunge by taking a quick step backwards. The girl did not stand still and quickly attacked. Her technique was not as exquisite as Luke's, but her power and speed were greater. Luke, thanks to landing on the heel of his front leg, had the strength to barely defend himself from Enid's attack. He quickly returned to the guard position and began to defend himself and dodge Enid's violent attacks. This girl has no technique whatsoever," thought Luke, dodging a lunge that passed mere inches from his face. Although she had no technique, Enid's speed and strength were incredible. If Luke hadn't gone through Natasha's hellish training, he would have lost in just a few moves. He had to defend and counterattack depending on his perfect technique. Enid, despite her imperfect guard, had impressive reflexes and great instincts. She always managed to defend herself at the last second. The practice fight between Luke and Enid lasted 10 minutes. It was the most intense of all and the most professional. Luke could not keep up. Enid's endurance was superior to his. Advantages of having the superior physique of a werewolf. At one point he couldn't maintain his perfect technique and lost. "You win," said Luke, taking off his helmet and sitting down warily. It was a frantic 10 minutes. He never thought that after going through Natasha's hellish training he would be physically tired. "That was a great fight. You have perfect technique," Enid said in surprise as she took off her helmet and sat down next to Luke. She was tired too, though not as tired as Luke. She knew her physique was superior to the other outcasts since she was a werewolf. She was surprised Luke could last this long and at several points thought he would lose. "Your instincts are amazing," Luke praised. Taking Enid by surprise, a wide grin broke out on Enid's face. It was the first time Luke had ever praised her. This was a breakthrough for her. "Although with your psychic abilities, the combat would have been different," said Enid, not knowing why she wanted to cheer Luke up. "A loss is a loss," said Luke. He had a high ego, but he knew how to accept when he lost. "Another fight?" asked Enid, standing up and reaching out to Luke. "Fine," nodded Luke, accepting Enid's hand and standing up. Their relationship improved. they were both growing closer for the same reason. Because they knew their personalities were authentic. Chapter 19. Immobilization. One Saturday afternoon, Luke was lying in bed reading a book he had bought some time ago. Nevermore was a boarding school. On Saturdays and Sundays you didn't have classes, but you had to stay on the school grounds. You had to ask permission to visit Jericho. Since he had no friends the entire weekend, he was locked in his room reading books, continuing his psychic training, or wasting time on the internet. "You're wasting your youth," exclaimed Edgar with indignation. He couldn't believe that his descendant spent his weekends locked in his room. What's wrong with him now? Thought Luke, looking up from his book and staring at the ghost of his great-great-grandfather. Nevermore will be your most peaceful stage. You must make the most of it. Once you get out of here, it will be an all-out war against the damned Spellmans, shouted Edgar. Instead of having as much fun as you say, I should train, Luke said with a grimace. Thanks to Xavier not being in the bedroom, he could talk to Edgar quietly. Overtraining is not good. There comes a point where it is ineffective and can be counterproductive if you overtrain. Once you complete your training routine, you should use the time to have fun and not be a loner, Edgar said, remembering his younger days when he would get drunk and date some girl the same age as Luke. The times were different. I'd rather stay here, said Luke, turning his attention back to his book. This smelly brat, thought Edgar, clenching his fist. Rather than waste time procrastinating, it's better to train a little since you have so much free time, said Edgar. Didn't you just say that overtraining is bad? Asked Luke. I will teach you a very useful telekinesis skill for combat, said Edgar, getting Luke's attention, who put his book aside and looked at him intently. Which one? Asked Luke. Immobilization, replied Edgar with a slight smile, seeing that he caught Luke's interest. Immobilizing a person? Asked Luke with a raised eyebrow. Yes, a person or any living thing, nodded Edgar. I don't think it's too hard, said Luke, losing interest. He could already move 180 objects and throw them at high speeds. A very heavy person could weigh between 90 to 100 inc, a weight that could easily immobilize. Even an obese person weighing no more than 180 could be immobilized with his telekinesis. You must be thinking that because you can move 180 weights, immobilizing a normal person is pretty easy, right? Asked Edgar, and Luke nodded. You're very wrong. Immobilizing a person is very different from moving lifeless inanimate objects. A person will not stay still while being controlled by your telekinesis. He will try to break free. Also, the technique is different from moving objects, Edgar said. How hard can it be? Said Luke. With his 180, it wouldn't be hard to immobilize an average person no matter how much he wanted to break free. He had already thought that shortly he could immobilize a transformed hide or werewolf. That's what a person who never tried to immobilize a person would say, Edgar said with contempt, and pissed Luke off since he was right. He had never used his telekinetic power to immobilize a person or living thing. Let's do it, it'll be a piece of cake, Luke said, pissed off. I hope you don't buy your words. The first thing is for you to get a training partner. Find someone light to start with, a girl if possible, said Edgar. Luke grimaced at this request. Who would agree to be his training dummy at Nevermore? Oh, sorry, I forgot you don't even have a friend. At least you'll meet a girl, Edgar said with a smirk. Shut up, I have someone in mind, growled Luke, standing up. He put on his sneakers, a black hoodie, the necklace, and walked out of the dorm. Did you make a friend? Asked Edgar with a little smile. Since Luke didn't wear it when he had classes, he didn't know about the relationships he had. He only knew he was a loner because he always stayed in his dorm room if possible. Luke didn't respond. When he got to the common room from his dorm, many were surprised that he had gone out. Luke ignored the stares and walked out of the dorm. Her dorm is for girls only, I can't go in, thought Luke, thinking about how to meet the one person he might consider closest at Nevermore. It was Enid. Although he could try to sneak into the girls' dorm, it would be too conspicuous, and he doesn't want to attract attention or get caught, so he has no choice but to wander the Nevermore grounds in search of Enid. His relationship with Enid had improved since that first practice bout in the fencing class. From that point on, they were always practice partners in fencing classes, so Luke was planning to ask her for help with his training. Knowing Enid's personality and that she is always interested in him, she should accept without much trouble. The Nevermore grounds were very large, much more than what was shown in the Netflix series. The day was clear with few clouds in sight, a perfect day to spend time with friends outdoors, as long as you have friends. I'll look in the left courtyard, Luke thought, heading to the courtyard usually filled with students along with their friends hanging out. This courtyard was a large outdoor area surrounded by walls and walkways. In its center is a fountain with a large dead tree. At its edge is a statue of Edgar Allan Poe. It is the courtyard that was featured in the series. As he arrived, he noticed a large number of groups of students chatting and laughing with their friends. Near the fountain, there were several tables with benches for the students to sit at. At one of the tables Luke saw Enid sitting and chatting happily with her friends. That's Yoko and Divina, thought Luke, recognizing the two friends Enid was chatting with. Yoko Tanaka is a very popular vampire. In the series she had an unimportant role. Divina is a mermaid, she also had a supporting role in the series. Luke sat on a bench along the walkways and watched the courtyard with all the students chatting and laughing happily. Youth, Luke muttered. Edgar, floating next to him, came to hear him and smiled. You see, you must make the most of your time of youth. You won't be young for life, said Edgar. Why should I follow the youth that others want? Other people can enjoy their youth by reading books or wasting time on the internet. I thought outcasts didn't follow stereotypes, commented Luke, taking Edgar by surprise, as his descendants' argument had logic. You're right, but humans are social beings. It's not good to shut yourself away in your world and not interact with anyone, Edgar commented in a more serious tone. Is that Luke? Asked Yoko, looking off into the distance at Luke sitting on one of the dark catwalks. Yes, whoa, that's the first time I've seen him out on a weekend, commented Divina, looking towards Luke. Luke's, thought Enid, turning her head and recognizing the boy right away. As she was about to get up from her seat and walk towards Luke, both Yoko and Divina grabbed her arms. You stay here, Enid. You always talk to him. You can't go talk to him as soon as you see him. You'll look like a desperate girl, said Yoko, and Divina nodded, agreeing with her. But, said Enid reluctantly. It was the first time she had seen Luke on a Saturday outside his dorm. She couldn't pass up this opportunity to talk to him, but seeing the looks on her friend's face as she sat back down, Yoko was right. She was always the one trying to talk to Luke. The latter never took the first step to talk to her. Won't you ask your friend to help you train? Asked Edgar, looking at Luke after finishing their short conversation. Luke shook his head. He saw Enid chatting happily with her friends. How would he approach her to say, do you want to be my training dummy? He got up from the bench and started walking to go to the gym. Since he was out of his bedroom, he would at least train physically. This time Edgar didn't say anything. He didn't scoff and followed Luke silently. When he turned a corner, he bumped into a person. It was a girl who was looking at her cell phone. As she collided with Luke, she fell to the ground. Ouch, the girl mumbled, grabbing her forehead. Luke only lost his balance a little, as he was distracted thinking about some things. He didn't have enough reaction to dodge. Sabrina Jones, thought Luke, recognizing the blonde girl, a psychic capable of creating and controlling fire. Chapter 20. Practice with Sabrina. Aren't you going to help me? Asked Sabrina, looking up from the floor at Luke. Are you one-armed? Asked Luke, showing no sign of helping her. This girl was like Bianca, the most popular one. She most likely had a lot of guys after them drooling and was used to being pampered. Just the thought of it bothers him. You're as rude as everyone says, Sabrina said, getting up from the floor and shaking the dirt off her clothes. Sabrina was wearing a loud red pullover, a black skirt with black tights, and dark shoes. She wore a headband in her blonde hair. Her nails were painted red, as were her lips. Luke clicked his tongue and started walking again without paying Sabrina any more attention. This is the first time I've seen you out on a day off, Sabrina commented, following Luke. Are you a stalker? I can give you an autograph if you want, Luke said with a slight smirk, looking sideways at Sabrina. I'm not a stalker and I don't want your autograph. Your last name is very famous in Nevermore. There's even a statue of your great-great-grandfather. Plus your book Carrie is also very famous. A lot of people notice that you don't leave your dorm on the weekends, Sabrina commented, unbothered by Luke's teasing. Luke grimaced when he heard this. He didn't think so many students would be watching whether or not he left his dorm. This was normal though. The culprit in this was Carrie. His last name was very famous at Nevermore, but not to the point that so many students would be watching whether or not he left his dorm. The problem was Carrie's resounding success. It had been a little over a month since the book was published, and according to data passed on to him by his publisher, it sold more than 100 copies in 1 month. A resounding success. A book that sells 100 copies is considered a success, but for a book by a first-time author to achieve that figure in a month is something rarely seen. Geniuses like Stephen King could do it. This made Luke's fame grow by leaps and bounds. He had already passed 100 followers on various social networks, and many news portals and YouTube were talking about his work and him. Many treated him as a genius and praised Carrie. Others criticized Carrie for being too gory and that Luke's head was wrong for writing something like that. 100 copies in a month. Luke couldn't believe it. He would take a 12 royalty. Carrie was priced at $8 and it was paperback, so in 1 month he got 800 of which is 96 will go to Luke, discounting some taxes a little less. In 1 month he makes what a pro makes in a year. Luke drooled at the thought of this number. He already wanted to get his hands on the money. He had become a literary celebrity in just over a month. His stories were being seen by thousands of people, the same with his photos and so on. Many wanted to interview him. But the publisher was taking care of that. In a short time he would have his first interview. It would be embarrassing, but he would have to do it. "Are you listening to me?" asked Sabrina, running her hand in front of Luke's eyes several times. "Huh, what were you saying?" asked Luke, snapping back to reality. He hadn't heard a word Sabrina was saying. "God," I asked, "what were you doing?" "Weirdly, you came out of your room. You're such a celebrity hermit," said Sabrina with a slight smile. "I'm not a hermit," growled Luke. "I'm going to training." He added, "Oh, can I join you? I'll be helpful," asked Sabrina. That's okay," said Luke. He didn't think he would find a replacement for Enid so easily. He didn't tell Sabrina that he would use her as a training dummy. He'll tell her when he gets to the gym so she can't refuse anymore. "Being a famous writer always helps," Edgar commented with a slight smile. They arrived at the gymnasium where they had their fencing classes. The place was empty, but it was allowed if the students wanted to practice in their free time, although the fencing equipment they had to borrow. "What do you want to practice? Do we have a psychic practice bout or what?" asked Sabrina curiously. "How much do you weigh?" asked Luke, surprising Sabrina with the strange question. "You don't ask a girl that," said Sabrina with a pout, but Luke remained silent, waiting for her answer. "This guy," thought Sabrina in disbelief that her charm wasn't working. 42, 5 93, 7 pounds, replied Sabrina. "That's a good weight to start practicing." "Explain to her what immobilization is," Edgar said, and Luke started to explain to Sabrina what her role would be in this training. "So, you want to use me as a training dummy?" asked Sabrina after Luke finished his explanation. "Yes," Luke replied. "Okay, let's get started," Sabrina said, and Luke was surprised at how easily she agreed. Maybe this is why she is one of the most popular girls. "First, I will try to immobilize you, but do not try to free yourself," Luke said, and Sabrina nodded as she waited quietly. According to Edgar, he first had to get used to the technique of immobilizing a person. Luke didn't understand much, but he followed the instructions the ghost gave him. "Concentrate, try to immobilize her like you would do when you control an object near you," said Edgar, and Luke started to control his powers towards Sabrina. Sabrina, who was playing with a lock of her hair, was suddenly immobilized. An outside force restricted her movements. She could only move her eyes and could only continue to breathe. As Luke told her, she did not try to free herself. Luke, the cause of this, had sweat on his forehead. He was using all his concentration to keep Sabrina still in place, and it was very difficult. "Why is this so hard?" thought Luke, sensing that he wouldn't last much longer. He knew Sabrina wasn't putting up any resistance. If she had, he couldn't have kept her restrained. After 30 miserable seconds, Luke couldn't hold on any longer, and Sabrina regained her mobility. "You see, I told you, trying to control a living thing with your telekinesis is much more difficult than with lifeless objects. Otherwise, it would be very easy to learn how to fly," Edgar said. Luke could only nod silently and accept that he was wrong. On his first attempt, he spent 30 seconds immobilizing a person. Even though the girl isn't very heavy, it's still quite a feat, thought Edgar without telling Luke this. Usually a psychic starts his training by immobilizing small animals like squirrels, birds, etc. Sabrina also looked with surprise, but quickly hid it. "That's it," asked the girl. "No, now I have to repeat it many more times to get used to it," Luke replied after catching his breath. He didn't think it would be so different and difficult to immobilize a person. "Good," nodded Sabrina, even though it wasn't nice the feeling of being immobilized. She agreed to keep helping Luke. "Then if you need anything, I'll help you," Luke said. He didn't like owing anyone anything. "Oh good, I hope you keep your word," Sabrina said with a smile. The workout continued. Luke managed to get the time to 2 minutes. But by the time Sabrina tried to free herself, she could only hold on for 20 seconds. Too short a time considering Sabrina has a delicate figure and no great physical strength. If she were Enid, she could free herself instantly thanks to her superior werewolf strength. Wanting to immobilize a hide, what a joke, he's a long way from that. He was very naive to think he could immobilize a hide easily. What he could do is crush him by throwing objects at him at high speed. "That's it. Do you want to practice something specific?" asked Luke, looking at Sabrina. Since Sabrina helped him with his training, it's time for him to help with her training or whatever. "You're too tired. Another day you will help me. For now, pass me your number," replied Sabrina, pulling out her cell phone. "What do you want my number for?" asked Luke. "How am I going to ask you to help me if you hardly ever leave your room?" said Sabrina, and Luke grunted, but he couldn't argue against that logic, so he passed her his number. "I have to go meet some friends. I'd invite you, but I'm sure you won't accept." See you, Sabrina said with a slight smile as she walked out of the gym. If you want to advance with the immobilization technique, you must practice every day. So you must have a person to help you, said Edgar. I won't train every day. I already owe that girl one favor. Luke said. He couldn't ask Sabrina to help him every day. He'd have endless favors to give in return. I don't think she'll do it for a favor. Besides, at best you'll have to help her practice like she did with you, Edgar said, looking strangely at Luke. I won't ask that girl to help me again, Luke said stubbornly. He hardly knew her well enough to ask her to help him every day in his practice. He would try asking Enid since he was closer to her. It is difficult for him to trust someone, Edgar thought, stepping back into the necklace. He had known his great-great-grandson for several months now, and every day he learned more about Luke's personality. He realized that Luke didn't trust people and had a lonely yet arrogant personality. Usually a loner or antisocial person has a more submissive personality, but this was not the case with Luke. John, Luke's father, had a very different personality than his son. He was extroverted and the most popular student. After all, his last name was Poe and he was very talented. The only thing they were alike in was the attitude to make frivolous and rational decisions. Even Edgar noticed that Luke did not fully trust him or Natasha. It would be common for a child who lived all his life in an orphanage to meet members of their families and treat them in a more loving and dependent way. But this was not the case. In time he will open up, thought Edgar without giving more importance to the subject.